In the gentle darkness of night, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, let us journey together across the vast expanse of time, back to the ancient shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Two great civilizations, Rome and Carthage, once gazed across those azure waters at one another, their destinies intertwined in ways neither could have imagined. Tonight, as your breathing slows and your mind begins to drift, we will explore their remarkable story. A tale of courage and conflict, ambition and resilience, triumph and tragedy. The salt-tinged breeze carries whispers of long-silenced voices, merchants haggling in bustling harbours, senators debating in marble halls, generals plotting strategies under canvas tents. These echoes of antiquity have much to teach us, not only about the ancient world, but about our own human nature, our capacity for both tremendous achievement and profound miscalculation. This is the story of the Punic Wars, a series of conflicts that would shape the destiny of the Mediterranean world and beyond, leaving an indelible mark on history that resonates even to this day. So close your eyes, rest your head upon your pillow, and allow yourself to be transported through the centuries. If you find this journey soothing and enlightening, perhaps consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let us begin with the origins of one of history's most fascinating civilizations, Carthage, the great maritime power that would challenge Rome for supremacy. Town Stocksop, origins of Carthage. Long before Rome cast its shadow across the Mediterranean, another civilization was flourishing on the shores of North Africa. Carthage, its very name derived from the Phoenician Court Adasht, meaning new city, began as a colonial outpost of the Phoenicians, those legendary seafarers of the ancient world. The Phoenicians, originating from what is now Lebanon, had established a network of trading settlements across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus to Spain, creating a commercial empire bound together by their mastery of the seas. According to legend, beautifully preserved in Virgil's Aeneid, though coloured by later Roman perspectives, Carthage was founded around 812 BCE by Queen Dido, also known as Elissa. She was a princess of the Phoenician city of Tyre, who fled her homeland after her brother, King Pygmalion, murdered her husband Asabas out of greed for his wealth. With a small but loyal group of followers, Dido sailed westward across the Mediterranean, eventually reaching the fertile shores of North Africa near modern-day Tunis. There, the story goes, she negotiated with local Berber rulers to purchase as much land as could be covered by an ox hide. Demonstrating the cunning and resourcefulness that would come to characterize her people, Dido cut the hide into thin strips and arranged them to encircle a substantial area, the hill later known as Barca, which would become the citadel of her new city. Whether historical truth or founding myth, this story captures something essential about the Carthaginian character: pragmatic, clever, and determined. As you rest and listen to these ancient tales, imagine the Mediterranean Sea 2.5 millennia ago. Its waters plied by ships with distinctive curved prows, their sails billowing in winds that carried them to distant shores. The same moon that watches over you tonight once illuminated those early settlers as they built their homes on foreign soil, perhaps gazing back eastward toward the homeland they had left behind. From these humble beginnings, Carthage grew with remarkable speed. Its natural harbour, one of the finest in the Mediterranean, provided shelter for merchant vessels and established the settlement as a crucial waypoint for maritime trade. The city's position was strategically perfect, situated at a narrowing of the Mediterranean where ships crossing between the eastern and western basins would naturally pass. This geographic advantage, combined with the Phoenician tradition of seamanship and commerce, allowed Carthage to prosper and expand its influence. By the 6th century BCE, after the fall of Tyre to the Babylonians in 573 BCE, Carthage had emerged as the leading Phoenician city and the inheritor of their maritime trading networks. No longer a mere colony, it had become the center of a commercial empire spanning the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians established their own colonies, controlled valuable trade routes, and developed a distinctive culture that blended Phoenician traditions with influences from their North African surroundings. The city itself grew into a marvel of urban planning. Built on a peninsula extending into the Gulf of Tunis, Carthage was protected on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by massive walls, reportedly 45 feet high and 30 feet thick. Within these defenses, a sophisticated city took shape, with residential quarters, marketplaces, temples, and public buildings arranged in an orderly grid. The harbour complex was particularly impressive, featuring an outer commercial harbour and an inner circular military harbour that could accommodate 220 warships, with ship sheds and repair facilities that were engineering wonders of their age. As you drift deeper into relaxation, envision the golden glow of North African sunlight on limestone buildings rising above the blue waters. Hear the distant calls of sailors and merchants. Smell the cedar wood of ships fresh from distant forests. Feel the weight of Tyrian purple cloth, that precious commodity for which the Phoenicians were renowned, as it passes through your fingers. This was Carthage in its early glory, a city of traders and seafarers, growing steadily in wealth and confidence, not yet aware of the distant power rising on the Italian peninsula that would one day challenge its very existence. From this flourishing center of commerce and culture, our story flows naturally to the society that developed within those impressive walls, a unique civilization with its own customs, beliefs, and way of life. As Carthage matured from colonial outpost to imperial power, its internal structures and cultural practices evolved to support its expanding role in the Mediterranean world. Within the walls of ancient Carthage flourished a society unlike any other in the Mediterranean world, a unique blend of Phoenician heritage, North African influences, and adaptations born of their mercantile empire. As your mind continues to relax, let us explore the daily rhythms and deeper structures of this remarkable civilization that would one day challenge Rome itself. At its heart, Carthage was a commercial republic. Unlike many ancient societies built primarily on agricultural foundations, the Carthaginian economy revolved around trade and the sea. Their merchants ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules, modern Strait of Gibraltar, into the Atlantic, sailed north to Britain for tin, south along the African coast for ivory and gold, and maintained extensive networks across the Mediterranean. This commercial focus shaped every aspect of their society, from governance to religion, from urban planning to social hierarchies. The sound of many languages mingled in Carthaginian marketplaces. Punic, their native tongue, derived from Phoenician, Greek, various Italian and Iberian dialects, and the languages of North African peoples. Imagine yourself walking through these bustling markets, where merchants arranged their wares with practiced precision. Spanish silver, British tin, ivory from south of the Sahara, amber from the Baltic, fine textiles, exotic spices. The wealth generated by this trade supported a sophisticated urban life with public amenities that rivaled those of any Mediterranean city. Carthaginian government evolved from monarchy to a complex republican system dominated by wealthy merchant families. At its head stood two annually elected magistrates called suffetes, roughly analogous to Roman consuls. A powerful council of elders composed of the wealthiest citizens, often compared to the Roman Senate-shaped polity, while a broader assembly had limited but important powers. This balanced system functioned effectively for centuries, providing stable governance that facilitated commercial growth while preventing any single individual from gaining too much power, until later times when military emergencies would elevate certain generals to positions of extraordinary influence. Religious life in Carthage centered on a pantheon inherited from their Phoenician ancestors, but evolved with local characteristics. Baal-Hamon, the chief male deity associated with fertility and vegetation, shared prominence with Tanit, a goddess who became increasingly important over time as the protectress of the city. Their temples occupied prominent positions in the urban landscape, with the Temple of Eshmaun, god of healing, situated at the highest point of the Barca hill, visible to ships approaching the harbour as a landmark of the city's devotion. One aspect of Carthaginian religion has attracted particular attention and controversy: the practice of child sacrifice, or what scholars call Tophet. Archaeological discoveries have unearthed urns containing the cremated remains of young children, often with inscriptions suggesting ritual dedication to Baal-Hamon, while Roman accounts, which must be read with caution given their hostility toward Carthage, describe widespread and regular child sacrifice. Modern scholarship suggests a more nuanced reality. Many of the remains may have been of children who died naturally and received special ritual treatment, though some element of sacrifice, particularly during times of crisis, seems supported by both archaeological and textual evidence. The daily life of ordinary Carthaginians revolved around the rhythms of commerce and the sea. Fishermen set out before dawn in small craft to harvest the bounty of the Mediterranean. Craftsmen, metalworkers, potters, weavers, shipwrights plied their trades in specialized districts of the city. Farmers cultivated the fertile lands surrounding the urban center, producing grain, olives, and the famous Punic apples, likely citrus fruits. Carthaginian agricultural expertise was renowned. Their treatises on farming were so respected that after destroying the city, the Romans would translate one such work by Mago for their own use, the only Carthaginian text substantially preserved through Roman efforts. Family life centered on the household, typically a courtyard home inspired by Eastern models, but adapted to North African conditions. Marriage customs encouraged unions within elite families to preserve wealth and status, though, as in most ancient societies, women had limited public roles. Yet archaeological evidence suggests Carthaginian women enjoyed somewhat greater status than their counterparts in some other Mediterranean societies, particularly in religious contexts where priestesses of Tanit held positions of considerable influence. The arts flourished in this wealthy mercantile society. Carthaginian craftsmen created fine jewelry incorporating Egyptian and Greek motifs alongside their own distinctive styles. Their metalwork was sophisticated, their textiles prized throughout the Mediterranean. While few examples of Carthaginian literature have survived Rome's eventual destruction of the city, we know they had a rich literary tradition. Histories, religious texts, practical manuals, and poetry. Mostly lost to us now, except through occasional references in Greek and Roman sources. Perhaps most remarkable was Carthage's cosmopolitan character. Unlike Athens or Rome, which emphasized their distinctive ethnic identities, Carthage embraced a multicultural ethos reflecting its trading networks. Foreign merchants were welcomed, foreign practices often incorporated rather than rejected. This openness served their commercial interests well, but may have limited the development of the kind of fierce, patriotic identity that would later characterize their Roman adversaries. As night deepens around you and these ancient scenes form in your mind, consider how the legacy of this commercial civilization continues in our modern global trading networks. The pragmatic Carthaginian approach to international relations, prioritizing profitable exchange over territorial conquest for much of their history, feels surprisingly modern. Their multicultural port cities, where different languages and customs mingled freely for mutual benefit, prefigure our own diverse urban centers. As the Carthaginian Empire expanded its commercial reach westward and northward, another civilization was taking shape on the Italian peninsula, one whose path would eventually cross with Carthage in momentous ways. The contrast between these two powers, one a maritime trading empire, the other a land-based agricultural society with growing military ambitions, would shape the coming conflict in profound ways. Let us now turn our attention to early Rome and the foundations of the power that would ultimately challenge Carthaginian supremacy in the Mediterranean world. As the stars wheel slowly overhead and the world grows quieter around you, let us turn our attention now to the Italian peninsula, where another great civilization was taking shape, Rome, whose destiny would become so fatefully intertwined with that of Carthage. While Carthaginian ships were plying the Mediterranean waters in pursuit of trade, the Romans were gradually building a different kind of power, rooted in the soil of central Italy and in institutions that would prove remarkably durable. Like many ancient societies, Rome wrapped its origins in myth and legend. According to these treasured stories, the city was founded in 753 BCE by Romulus, who along with his twin brother Remus had been abandoned as infants, suckled by a she-wolf and raised by a shepherd. After killing his brother in a dispute over the site of their new settlement, Romulus established the city that would bear his name on the Palatine Hill overlooking the Tiber River. To populate his city, he offered asylum to outlaws and exiles from surrounding communities, and when they needed wives, the Romans famously abducted women from their neighbors, the Sabines, an event known as the Rape of the Sabine women. You know, ancient sources suggest it ended in reconciliation and merger rather than continued hostility. Behind these colorful legends, archaeological evidence reveals a more gradual process. Small settlements on Rome's 7 hills coalesced into a unified community around the 8th century BCE, roughly contemporaneous with the traditional founding date. The location was auspicious, far enough inland to be protected from pirates, yet accessible by river to the sea, situated where the Tiber could be easily forded, at a crossroads of trade routes running north-south and east-west through the Italian peninsula. This geographic advantage would serve Rome well, as it grew from a cluster of villages into a city-state and eventually an empire. For 2.5 centuries after its founding, Rome was ruled by kings first Romulus, followed by 6 others according to tradition. This period saw the gradual incorporation of neighboring peoples, particularly the Etruscans to the north and the Sabines, whose cultural influences helped shape early Roman society. The last kings were Etruscan, bringing with them advanced engineering knowledge that gave Rome its first major public works, including the Cloaca Maxima, Great Sewer, that drained the marshy area between the hills and allowed the development of the Roman Forum. But the Romans developed a deep aversion to monarchy that would shape their political thought for centuries to come. According to tradition, the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was overthrown in 509 BCE after his son raped a noblewoman named Lucretia, who took her own life rather than live with the shame. This event catalyzed existing discontent with Tarquin's tyrannical rule and led to revolution. The monarchy was abolished and replaced with a republic, a system of government that would endure for nearly 5 centuries and shape Western political thought ever after. As you rest and allow these ancient stories to unfold in your imagination, picture the early Roman Republic, not yet the marble city of imperial times, but a more modest place of wooden temples and simple homes, its citizens primarily farmers who worked the land surrounding the urban center. The air carries the earthy scent of freshly plowed fields and domestic hearthfires, while in the forum, the rustle of togas accompanies serious deliberations about matters of state. There is a solemnity to these proceedings, a reverence for tradition and ancestral customs that would remain characteristic of Roman culture even in its later grandeur. The Roman Republic's political structure was ingeniously designed to prevent the concentration of power that had characterized the monarchy. Executive authority was vested in 2 consuls, elected annually and possessing equal power, so that each could check the other. In times of emergency, a dictator could be appointed for a strictly limited term of 6 months. A senate composed of elder statesmen, originally heads of the most prominent families, advised the magistrates, while popular assemblies gave citizens varying degrees of participation in governance. This system was not democratic in the modern sense. It was explicitly designed to balance the interests of different social classes while ensuring that the wealthy and well-born maintained predominant influence. The primary social division was between patricians, aristocrats who traced their lineage to the original senators appointed by Romulus, and plebeians, everyone else, from prosperous landowners to humble craftsmen. This distinction had religious as well as political significance, as only patricians could hold certain priesthoods and perform particular sacred rites, essential to maintaining divine favor toward Rome. The early history of the Republic was marked by a prolonged conflict of the orders, as plebeians struggled to gain greater rights and political representation. Through a series of secessions, essentially general strikes in which the plebeians withdrew from the city and threatened to establish their own community, they gradually won significant concessions. The right to elect their own officials called tribunes, who could veto actions of other magistrates, a written code of law, the 12 tables, that prevented arbitrary legal interpretations, and eventually access to all political offices. This process of accommodation and compromise, though often contentious, established a pattern of institutional adaptation that helped give the Roman system its remarkable durability. Religion permeated every aspect of Roman life. Unlike the Greeks with their richly developed mythology, early Roman religion focused more on ritual practice than elaborate stories about the gods. Proper observance of ceremonies was believed essential to maintaining the Pax Deorum peace with the gods that ensured Rome's well-being. Every important action, public or private, began with seeking divine approval through various forms of divination. The Romans readily adopted deities from conquered peoples, seeing this religious syncretism as both pragmatic, gaining the protection of additional gods, and a form of cultural incorporation that facilitated political integration. The Roman family structure reflected and reinforced these conservative, hierarchical values. At its head stood the paterfamilias, the oldest male, who held nearly absolute authority over his household, wife, children, unmarried female relatives, and slaves. This patriarchal model extended metaphorically to the state, where the Senate was often referred to as the fathers of the Republic. Ancestral tradition was revered. Prominent families displayed wax masks of their distinguished forebears and paraded these during funeral processions, creating a visible link between present and past generations. Alongside this respect for tradition, however, the Romans displayed remarkable pragmatism and adaptability. When they encountered useful ideas or practices in other cultures, they readily adopted and adapted them. This openness to practical innovation, combined with their talent for organization and administration, would serve them well as they began to expand beyond the immediate vicinity of Rome. The early republic faced numerous external threats. The deposed Etruscan king initially attempted to regain his throne with support from neighboring cities. Later came raids from various Italian peoples and a devastating invasion by the Gauls in 3090 BCE, during which Rome was sacked and burned, a trauma that lived long in Roman memory. Yet each crisis ultimately strengthened the young republic. After the Gallic disaster, Rome rebuilt its defenses, reformed its military organization, and embarked on a more systematic program of expansion. This expansion began with the gradual conquest of the Italian peninsula. Through a combination of military victory and astute diplomacy, Rome extended its influence over neighboring peoples. Unlike many ancient conquerors, the Romans often offered defeated enemies a form of citizenship and integration into their system, rather than mere subjugation. This policy of inclusiveness, though always with Rome clearly dominant, created a network of allies with a stake in Roman success, multiplying the human resources available for further expansion. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had secured control over most of the Italian peninsula. Its army had evolved from a citizen militia into a more professional fighting force, organized in legions that combined flexibility with discipline in a manner that made them increasingly formidable. Roman soldiers were primarily infantry, equipped with short swords, ideal for close combat, rectangular shields, and javelins designed to bend upon impact so they could not be thrown back. This practical equipment, combined with rigorous training and a willingness to adapt successful tactics from opponents, made the legion one of history's most effective military innovations. As your consciousness drifts between wakefulness and sleep, consider how different Rome was from Carthage in its fundamental orientation. While Carthage built its power on maritime trade, Rome remained essentially a land power, its citizens ideologically committed to agriculture even as the city grew. Where Carthaginian society celebrated commercial success and wealth from trade, Roman culture idealized the citizen farmer who worked his land and answered the call to arms when needed. These different foundations would shape how each power approached the coming conflict and ultimately help determine its outcome. The Roman system, tested and tempered by internal conflicts and external threats during its first 2.5 centuries, had developed into a remarkably resilient organism by the time it began to live beyond Italy. Its republican institutions, though far from perfect, provided stable governance. Its military was increasingly professional and effective. Its policy of incorporating conquered peoples created a growing pool of manpower. Rome was becoming a formidable power, just as its expanding influence would bring it into contact, and eventually conflict, with other major players in the Mediterranean world. As Rome's shadow lengthened across the Italian peninsula, the stage was being set for a confrontation with the established powers of the Mediterranean. Let us now turn to the broader geopolitical context that would bring Rome and Carthage into their fateful collision. A meeting of civilizations with profound consequences for the ancient world and the course of Western history. As night deepens and your body settles more comfortably into rest, let us widen our perspective to encompass the entire Mediterranean world in the decades before the Punic Wars. This vast inland sea, known to Romans as Mare Nostrum, our sea, was a complex mosaic of powers and influences, a world in which Rome and Carthage were just two players among many, though both were ascending in strength and ambition. The 3rd century BCE Mediterranean was dominated by several major powers, each controlling their own sphere of influence in an unstable balance. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the successors of Alexander the Great had carved his brief empire into competing kingdoms. Ptolemaic Egypt, with its capital at Alexandria, controlled the richest and most fertile territory. The Seleucid Empire stretched from Syria to the borders of India. The Antigonid dynasty ruled Macedonia and exercised influence over much of Greece. and various smaller kingdoms like Pergamon in Asia Minor maintained precarious independence by skillfully playing the larger powers against each other. These Hellenistic kingdoms were sophisticated, urbanized societies with complex economies, professional armies, and cultural ties to the Greek world. Their courts patronized art, literature, and science, making cities like Alexandria and Antioch centers of learning and innovation. Though they fought each other frequently, they shared a common cultural framework derived from Greek civilization as spread by Alexander's conquests. In the Western Mediterranean, two major powers had emerged: Carthage and Rome. Carthage controlled much of North Africa's coast from modern Libya to Morocco, southern Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. Its influence rested primarily on its maritime commercial network rather than direct territorial rule in many areas. Rome had recently consolidated control over the Italian peninsula through its system of alliances and colonies and was beginning to look outward, though it had not yet emerged as a major naval power. Between these great powers existed numerous smaller states, city-states, and tribal confederations, many of which maintained their independence by diplomatic skill and by playing larger powers against each other. Syracuse in Sicily was particularly important, a wealthy Greek colony that remained a significant force in its own right, sometimes allied with Carthage, sometimes with Rome, always seeking to preserve its autonomy amid the power struggles of large entities. Imagine, as you drift towards sleep, this Mediterranean world connected by seaborne trade routes that carried goods, people, and ideas across great distances. Grain from Egypt, olive oil from Greece, silver from Spain, fine pottery, textiles, and manufactured goods from various production centers, all moved across the waters in merchantmen whose square sails caught the seasonal winds. Piracy was a constant threat, making armed escorts necessary for valuable cargoes. Despite these dangers, Mediterranean peoples had been interconnected through trade networks for centuries before Rome and Carthage rose to prominence. The first recorded treaty between Rome and Carthage dates to 509 BCE, the very beginning of the Roman Republic, suggesting early recognition of each other's spheres of influence. This agreement, and subsequent treaties in 3048 and 279 BCE, established boundaries for trade and acknowledged each power's areas of control. For more than 2 centuries, Rome and Carthage maintained generally peaceful relations, occasionally even cooperating against common threats like the adventurer King Pyrrhus of Epirus, who invaded Italy and then Sicily between 280 to 275 BCE. These early contacts reveal a relationship that was cautious but not inherently hostile. Both powers recognized the utility of maintaining peace with each other while they dealt with more immediate concerns. For Rome, those concerns were primarily the consolidation of control over Italy and managing threats from Gauls to the north. For Carthage, priorities included maintaining its trading networks, managing relations with indigenous North African peoples, and competing with Greek colonies in Sicily and southern Italy. Sicily became the crucial point of contact and eventually conflict between the expanding spheres of Roman and Carthaginian influence. This large, fertile island lies just 5 miles from the Italian mainland at the Strait of Messina, while its western tip extends to within 100 miles of the North African coast near Carthage. Its strategic position commanding the narrowest part of the Mediterranean made it valuable to any power with maritime ambitions, while its agricultural productivity. It was a major grain producer, added economic significance to its strategic importance. For centuries, Sicily had been divided among 3 main powers. Carthage controlled the western part of the island. Syracuse, the most powerful Greek colony, dominated the east, and various smaller Greek cities maintained varying degrees of independence. This fragmented political landscape made Sicily a complex theatre for diplomacy and occasional conflict, as the various powers competed for advantage. As your breathing becomes deeper and more regular, envision the island of Sicily, its fertile plains rising to the dramatic height of Mount Etna, its coastline dotted with harbours, where ships from across the Mediterranean would call. Greek temples stood on promontories overlooking the sea, their marble columns gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. Inland, vast wheat fields fed populations far beyond the island's shores. This beautiful, productive land would soon become the flashpoint for a clash of civilizations. Rome's interest in Sicily increased after it completed the conquest of southern Italy by defeating the Greek colonies there in 275 BCE. Now controlling territory directly across the narrow strait from Sicily, Rome could not remain indifferent to events on the island. The Romans watched with concern as Syracuse and Carthage maneuvered for advantage, knowing that dominance of Sicily by either power could potentially threaten Italian security. The Greek cities of Sicily, for their part, were increasingly caught between the growing powers of Rome and Carthage. Some looked to Rome as a potential protector against Carthaginian encroachment, while others feared exchanging one dominant power for another. Syracuse, under the capable leadership of King Hero II, navigated these dangerous waters by maintaining a careful balance, sometimes tilting toward Carthage, sometimes toward Rome, always seeking to preserve its independence amid the power politics of larger states. Trade connections between these various powers created complex interdependencies alongside competitive tensions. Merchants from Carthage were familiar visitors to Italian ports, while Roman traders had access to certain Carthaginian-controlled markets according to treaty provisions. Cultural exchange accompanied commerce. Elite Romans were increasingly exposed to Hellenistic influences through contact with the Greek world, while Carthage had long incorporated elements of Greek culture alongside its Phoenician heritage. Religious practices and diplomatic protocols provided some common ground across cultural boundaries. The concept of making treaties under divine sanction was widespread throughout the Mediterranean world, as was the practice of diplomatic guest friendship. Xenia in Greek, hospitium in Latin, which created personal bonds of reciprocal obligation between elite families of different states. These shared customs facilitated interaction between powers, though they could not prevent conflict when vital interests clashed. As Rome and Carthage grew in power and confidence during the 3rd century BCE, their spheres of influence expanded toward an inevitable point of contact. Like storm clouds gathering slowly on opposite horizons, the two powers moved gradually toward a collision neither initially sought, but which came to seem increasingly unavoidable. The flashpoint would be provided by events in Sicily, specifically in the city of Messana, modern Messina, strategically located on the strait separating Sicily from the Italian mainland. The dynamics of geography made this confrontation almost inevitable. Rome, having secured the Italian peninsula, could not ignore a powerful maritime empire controlling territory just off its shores. Carthage, having established commercial dominance in the western Mediterranean, could not easily yield ground to an expanding power that might threaten its trade routes and territorial holdings. Sicily, positioned between them, became the natural arena for their contest. A contest that would escalate from local skirmish to existential struggle, reshaping the Mediterranean world and redirecting the course of Western history. As your consciousness continues to drift toward the peaceful shores of sleep, consider how these ancient power dynamics resonate with patterns we still see in our modern world. How geography shapes destiny, how trade creates both connections and competitions, how rising powers inevitably alter existing balances. The Mediterranean of the 3rd century BCE was a complex system where change in one area inevitably affected all others, much like our own interconnected global environment. The stage was now set for the First Punic War, a conflict that would begin not from deep-seated enmity or ideological differences, but from a series of miscalculations and a mutual unwillingness to back down once committed. Let us now examine how this momentous struggle began, as a local crisis in Sicily escalated into the longest continuous war in Roman history. As the night grows deeper and more still around you, let us examine how Rome and Carthage, powers that had maintained generally peaceful relations for centuries, found themselves drawn into a devastating conflict that neither had initially sought. The story begins in the city of Messana at the northeastern tip of Sicily, perfectly positioned to control the narrow strait separating the island from the Italian mainland. In 288 BCE, a group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines, Sons of Mars, had been dismissed from service by the city of Syracuse. Rather than returning to Italy, they seized control of Messana, killing or expelling many of the men and taking the women as wives. From this strategic location, the Mamertines began raiding the surrounding countryside and exacting tribute from nearby communities. For several decades, they operated as essentially a predatory state, tolerated by both Syracuse and Carthage as an irritant not worth the cost of elimination. This tenuous situation changed when Hero II became king of Syracuse in 270 BCE. Determined to restore order to northeastern Sicily, Hiero built up his forces and, in 265 BCE, decisively defeated the Mamertines in battle. With Syracuse's army now poised to take Messana itself, the Mamertines faced destruction. Desperate for protection, they appealed to both Rome and Carthage for assistance. The Mamertines' appeal presented both powers with a difficult decision. For Carthage, allowing Syracuse to eliminate the Mamertines would strengthen a potential rival in Sicily, while supporting the Mamertines would mean opposing Syracuse, with whom Carthage had recently been allied. For Rome, intervening would mean extending military operations beyond the Italian peninsula for the first time and potentially provoking conflict with Carthage, yet refusing might allow Carthage to strengthen its position in a location uncomfortably close to Italy. Initially, Carthage responded more quickly. A Carthaginian admiral stationed nearby sent a small garrison to Messana, temporarily forestalling a Syracusan attack. This move may have been made without full authorization from the Carthaginian Senate, but it reflected Carthage's traditional policy of preventing any single power from dominating Sicily. The Roman response was more delayed and conflicted. The Senate debated the Mamertines' appeal and apparently decided against intervention, perhaps reluctant to aid the Mamertines given their lawless seizure of Messana. An action uncomfortably similar to one perpetrated against the Italian city of Rhegium, whose perpetrators Rome had recently punished severely. However, the matter was then brought before the popular assembly, where arguments emphasizing the danger of Carthaginian expansion near Italian shores proved persuasive. The assembly voted to send assistance to the Mamertines. As you rest in the comfort of your bed, imagine the tension in that Roman assembly as citizens weighed a decision that would set their state on a new and fateful path. The air in the meeting place is thick with competing voices, warnings about Carthaginian encroachment, reminders of traditional Roman reluctance to intervene beyond Italy's shores, arguments about honor and advantage. Few, if any, of those citizens could have foreseen the decades of warfare their decision would initiate or how it would transform their republic. In 264 BCE, a Roman force under the consul Appius Claudius Caudex prepared to cross to Sicily, a momentous step as it represented Rome's first military expedition outside the Italian peninsula. Learning of this development, the Mamertines had second thoughts about the Carthaginian garrison in their city and persuaded them to withdraw, preferring Roman protection that might seem less likely to evolve into direct control. When Claudius arrived at Rhegium across the strait from Messana, he found a Carthaginian fleet patrolling the waters between Italy and Sicily. Attempting negotiations first, he crossed in a small boat to meet with Carthaginian officials, but failed to reach an agreement. Returning to Rhegium, he then managed to ferry his army across the strait at night, eluding the Carthaginian navy. Once in Messana, the Romans faced a combined threat from both Carthaginian and Syracusan forces, who had formed an alliance against this new intruder. In decisive fashion, Claudius defeated first the Syracusans and then the Carthaginians in separate engagements, securing Messana for Rome. These victories had far-reaching consequences. Hero II of Syracuse, recognizing which way the winds were blowing, quickly negotiated a favorable peace with Rome and would remain a loyal ally for the rest of his long reign. Carthage, however, perceived Rome's intervention as a direct challenge to its traditional sphere of influence in Sicily and prepared for war. What began as a limited intervention to secure Messana rapidly escalated. Both sides committed increasingly substantial forces to Sicily, transforming a local dispute into a major conflict. Within the first year, the Romans had advanced across northeastern Sicily, even threatening Syracuse before Hiero's timely switch of allegiance. Carthage responded by sending military reinforcements to its Sicilian strongholds, particularly Agrigentum on the southern coast. The stated causes of this conflict: the defense of Messana and response to requests for assistance. Obscure deeper factors that made war perhaps inevitable as the two powers grew in strength and ambition. Rome's recent conquest of southern Italy had brought it to the borders of Sicily and into the sphere of Greek politics in which Carthage had long been involved. Carthage's control of key islands including Sardinia, Corsica, and parts of Sicily created a strategic situation that was increasingly uncomfortable for Rome. Economic competition may have also played a role, as Rome's growing commercial interests potentially threatened Carthage's traditional dominance in maritime trade. As your mind drifts between wakefulness and slumber, consider how great conflicts often begin not from deep-seated hatred or fundamental ideological differences, but from miscalculation, mutual suspicion, and an unwillingness to accept perceived loss of status or security. Neither Rome nor Carthage initially sought a major war, yet neither was willing to back down once their prestige and interests seemed at stake. Small decisions, once made, created their own momentum, leading to a conflict far beyond what either side had anticipated. This escalation was facilitated by the lack of effective international mechanisms for resolving disputes between major powers, a problem not unfamiliar in later historical periods. Diplomacy in the ancient Mediterranean had developed protocols for making treaties and alliances, but had few tools for de-escalating conflicts once military operations had begun. Without trusted neutral mediators or institutions like modern international organizations, disputes between powers tended to be resolved through combat rather than compromise. Moreover, both sides likely underestimated their opponent and the duration and cost of the coming struggle. The Romans, confident after their successes in Italy, may have seen the Sicilian campaign as a logical extension of their previous conquests, not anticipating the challenges of warfare against a major naval power. The Carthaginians, with their superior fleet and experienced mercenary forces, may have expected to contain and eventually expel the Roman interlopers from Sicily without extraordinary effort. Both would be forced to adapt and innovate as the conflict expanded in scope and intensity. Thus began the First Punic War, named for the Latin word Punicus, referring to the Carthaginians' Phoenician ancestry. It would last for 23 years, 264–241 BCE, making it the longest continuous war in Roman history. What started as a local intervention to secure Messana would evolve into a struggle for control of Sicily and naval supremacy in the Western Mediterranean, forcing both powers to mobilize their resources on an unprecedented scale and adapt their strategies to unfamiliar forms of warfare. The story of this first great clash between Rome and Carthage, how it unfolded across land and sea, how it challenged both powers to evolve and adapt, and how it ultimately established Rome as a major Mediterranean power, awaits us as we continue our journey through this momentous chapter of ancient history. But first, let your consciousness continue to drift toward the peaceful shores of sleep, the rhythmic sound of Mediterranean waves perhaps echoing in your mind as you prepare to learn how this great conflict unfolded. Let the gentle weight of history now carry you deeper into relaxation as we explore the epic struggle that unfolded between Rome and Carthage, a conflict that would transform both powers and reshape the Mediterranean world. The First Punic War, spanning 23 years from 264 to 241 BCE, tested the limits of both civilizations' resources, adaptability, and determination. The early phases of the war centered on Sicily, where Roman forces achieved remarkable initial success. After securing Messana and establishing an alliance with Syracuse, the Romans moved against other Sicilian cities under Carthaginian control. In 262 BCE, they besieged Agrigentum, modern Agrigento, a major Carthaginian stronghold on Sicily's southern coast. After a siege of several months, a Carthaginian relief force was defeated, and the city fell to the Romans. Rather than treating the inhabitants with the moderation that had characterized their Italian conquests, the Romans sold much of Agrigentum's population into slavery, a harsh action that caused other Sicilian cities to resist rather than surrender, prolonging the conflict. As your breathing slows and your body settles more deeply into rest, imagine the ancient landscape of Sicily as it became a theater of war. Columns of legionaries march along dusty roads between olive groves and wheat fields. Siege engines stand before walled cities, while in the distance, the blue Mediterranean stretches toward the horizon, a sea the Romans were only beginning to understand they would need to master. By 260 BCE, the Romans recognized that they could not achieve complete victory in Sicily while Carthage controlled the seas. Carthaginian naval supremacy allowed them to reinforce and supply their remaining strongholds at will, while threatening Italian coastal cities with raids. To challenge Carthage at sea required Rome to build a substantial fleet from scratch, a daunting prospect for a power with little naval tradition. According to the historian Polybius, the Romans captured a beached Carthaginian quinquerem, a warship with 5 banks of oars, and used it as a model for their shipbuilding program. In a remarkable feat of determination, Rome constructed a fleet of 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes in just 2 months. Knowing their crews lacked the seamanship and experience of the Carthaginians, the Romans developed an innovation to leverage their land fighting expertise in naval combat. The corvus, meaning crow or raven, a boarding bridge with a heavy spike at the end. When lowered onto an enemy vessel, this device locked the ships together, allowing Roman marines to board and essentially turn a sea battle into an infantry engagement. This adaptation reflected Rome's pragmatic approach to warfare, adapting to overcome disadvantages and turning the unfamiliar into the familiar. In 260 BCE, this new Roman fleet engaged the Carthaginians at the Battle of Mylae under the command of the consul Gaius Duilius. Despite their inexperience, the Romans secured a stunning victory using their boarding bridges to neutralize Carthaginian naval expertise. The victory was celebrated in Rome with unprecedented honors for Duilius, including a columna rostrata, a column decorated with the bronze rams of captured ships erected in the Forum. Emboldened by this success, Rome expanded its naval program and began to envision a more ambitious strategy. If they could challenge Carthage at sea, perhaps they could threaten North Africa itself, Carthage's home territory. In 256 BCE, a massive Roman fleet of 330 ships carrying an invasion force defeated a Carthaginian fleet of 350 ships at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus off Sicily's southern coast, one of the largest naval battles of antiquity. The Roman commanders, consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Fulso, then proceeded to land in Africa near the city of Aspis, modern Kilibia in Tunisia. The African campaign initially went well for the Romans. Their army won a series of victories and advanced to within sight of Carthage itself, devastating the rich agricultural lands that were the source of much Carthaginian wealth. Confident of success, Regulus offered peace terms so harsh that the Carthaginians chose to continue fighting rather than accept what amounted to complete submission. At this critical juncture, with one consul and part of the invasion force recalled to Italy, Carthage hired Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary commander with extensive military experience, to reorganize their forces. As night deepens around you and these ancient events play out in your mind's eye, picture the North African landscape, fertile plains rising toward distant mountains, carefully tended fields and orchards now trampled by armies. The magnificent city of Carthage, with its imposing walls and harbors, standing defiant against the Roman threat. The stakes of this conflict have escalated far beyond the original dispute over Messana. Now the very survival of Carthage as an independent power hangs in the balance. Xanthippus dramatically reversed Carthage's fortunes. Understanding that the Carthaginian strength lay in their cavalry and elephants rather than their infantry, he deployed these forces effectively against the Roman legions. At the Battle of Tunis in 255 BCE, the Carthaginian army crushed the Roman invasion force, killing or capturing most of the troops. Regulus himself was taken prisoner, later becoming the subject of a famous Roman moral tale about keeping one's word even at the cost of one's life. Only 2,000 Romans escaped the disaster. A relief fleet sent from Rome managed to evacuate the survivors from their coastal fortress, but then encountered a severe storm off Sicily on the return journey. The Romans lost most of their fleet, supposedly 284 ships from a total of 364 and nearly 100,000 men, making this one of the worst maritime disasters in ancient history. This catastrophe temporarily crippled Roman naval power and ended their first attempt to bring the war directly to Carthaginian territory. The war now settled into a protracted struggle centered mainly on Sicily, with periodic naval campaigns and raids. Both sides experienced victories and defeats, the fortunes of war swinging back and forth without decisive advantage. The Carthaginians, under the capable leadership of Hamilcar Barca, father of the later famous Hannibal, conducted effective guerrilla operations from mountain strongholds like Eryx, modern Eris, while maintaining their major bases at Lilybaeum, modern Marsala, and Drepana, modern Trapani in western Sicily. The Romans, for their part, gradually gained control over more of Sicily, but failed to dislodge the Carthaginians from their remaining strongholds. A series of naval disasters, some from battles but more from storms, led to periods where Rome all but abandoned the sea, only to rebuild their fleets and return to naval warfare when resources allowed. The war became a test of endurance and will as much as military skill, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. By 249 BCE, after 15 years of war, both powers were showing signs of exhaustion. The Romans had lost several fleets, while Carthage struggled to finance its largely mercenary forces and maintain control of its remaining Sicilian possessions. That year saw another Roman naval disaster at the Battle of Drepana, where the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher lost 93 ships from his fleet of 123. According to legend, when the sacred chickens whose eating habits were used for divination refused to feed before the battle, a bad omen, Pulcher had them thrown overboard, declaring, "If they will not eat, let them drink." This impiety was later blamed for the defeat. The war entered a period of relative stalemate. On land, the Romans controlled most of Sicily, but could not capture the well-fortified Carthaginian strongholds. At sea, after the disaster at Drepana, Rome temporarily abandoned major naval operations. Hamilcar Barca conducted an effective campaign of raids and harassment from his mountain bases, but lacked the strength to drive the Romans from Sicily. Year after year, the conflict dragged on, draining the resources and testing the resolve of both powers. As you drift deeper towards sleep, imagine the weariness that must have settled over both sides as the war continued with no end in sight. Farms lay untended as men served year after year in armies and fleets. Treasuries were depleted by the enormous costs of maintaining forces and replacing lost ships. Yet neither Rome nor Carthage was willing to accept anything less than favorable terms, knowing that the outcome would determine which power would dominate the Western Mediterranean. The deadlock was finally broken by a remarkable private initiative that demonstrated the depth of Roman determination. In 243 BCE, with the state treasury depleted, wealthy Roman citizens financed the construction of a new fleet of 200 quinqueremes, built to an improved design that emphasized maneuverability. This fleet, under the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, seized the harbour of Drepana in 242 BCE and prepared to intercept Carthaginian supply ships. The decisive engagement came in March 241 BCE at the Battle of the Agates Islands off Sicily's western coast. A Carthaginian fleet, hastily dispatched to resupply their forces in Sicily, was intercepted by the Roman fleet under Catulus. Hampered by heavy loads of supplies and inexperienced crews, Carthage too had suffered from the long war and had to quickly man ships with inadequately trained sailors. The Carthaginian fleet was defeated. 50 ships were sunk and 70 captured, with the remainder fleeing back to Carthage. This naval defeat finally broke Carthaginian resolve. With their forces in Sicily now cut off from supply and reinforcement, and their treasury depleted by 23 years of war, the Carthaginians authorized their commander Hamilcar Barca to negotiate terms. The resulting Peace of Lutatius ended the First Punic War in 241 BCE. Under its terms, Carthage evacuated Sicily, agreed to pay a substantial war indemnity over 10 years, and released all Roman prisoners without ransom. Rome had emerged victorious in its first major conflict beyond the shores of Italy. The costs of this marathon war had been enormous for both sides. Rome had lost hundreds of ships and as many as 700,000 men over the 23-year struggle. Carthage had been forced to surrender its centuries-old holdings in Sicily and faced a severe financial burden in paying the war indemnity. Both powers had been tested to their limits, and both had revealed strengths and weaknesses that would shape their future relationship. For Rome, the war had transformed a primarily Italian power into a major Mediterranean force. The Romans had demonstrated remarkable adaptability in building a navy from scratch and learning the arts of naval warfare. They had shown extraordinary determination in persisting despite repeated setbacks and disasters. Perhaps most significantly, they had developed a taste for expansion beyond Italy and had established their first overseas province in Sicily, a pattern of provincial administration that would eventually extend throughout the Mediterranean world. For Carthage, the defeat meant not only the loss of Sicily, but the revelation of structural weaknesses in its military system. Reliance on mercenaries and subject allies had proved problematic when finances were strained, while the Roman system of citizen soldiers had demonstrated greater resilience. The peace had been made necessary not only by the naval defeat, but by the growing threat of unrest within Carthage's territories, as years of heavy taxation to finance the war had created widespread dissatisfaction. As the night embraces you, and these ancient struggles recede into the mists of history, consider how this first great contest between Rome and Carthage established patterns that would characterize their continued rivalry. Roman tenacity and adaptability had overcome Carthaginian experience and expertise. The conflict had escalated far beyond its original causes, becoming a struggle for dominance of the Western Mediterranean. And both powers had been changed by the experience. Rome emerging more confident and expansionist, Carthage weakened but not broken, nursing resentments that would influence its policies in the years to come. The Peace of Lutatius did not resolve the fundamental competition between these two great powers, but merely paused it. The tensions and rivalries that had fueled the First Punic War remained, and new grievances would soon arise to rekindle the conflict. But before these ancient adversaries would meet again on the battlefield, both faced serious internal challenges in the war's aftermath. Challenges that would shape their capabilities and strategies when hostilities eventually resumed. In the gentle quiet of night, as your body rests and your mind drifts between consciousness and dreams, let us explore the period between Rome and Carthage's first and second great conflicts, a time of recovery, internal struggles, and growing tensions that would eventually lead to renewed warfare. The 2 decades following the First Punic War saw both powers dealing with immediate crises while laying the groundwork for future confrontation. For Carthage, the aftermath of defeat brought immediate and severe challenges. The treasury was depleted by 23 years of warfare, and now faced the additional burden of a substantial war indemnity owed to Rome. More critically, the Carthaginian government found itself unable to pay the large force of mercenaries who had fought for them in Sicily and had been transported back to North Africa after the peace treaty. When the authorities attempted to negotiate reductions in the promised payments, the mercenaries, joined by many oppressed Libyan subjects who had long chafed under Carthaginian rule, rose in open revolt. This mercenary war, or inexpiable war, 241-237 BCE, quickly escalated into an existential threat to Carthage itself. The rebels, numbering perhaps 20,000 mercenaries from various regions, Gauls, Iberians, Ligurians, Balearic Islanders, Greeks and others, plus many more Libyan subjects, controlled much of Carthage's African territory. They were led by capable commanders familiar with Carthaginian military methods, and were fueled by both financial grievances and deeper resentments against Carthaginian rule. The conflict was characterized by exceptional brutality on both sides. According to Polybius, the rebels tortured and mutilated 700 Carthaginian prisoners, while Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, who had been recalled from Sicily to deal with the crisis, retaliated with similar treatment of rebel captives. The very survival of Carthage hung in the balance as rebel forces threatened the city itself and controlled most of its agricultural hinterland. As you rest in the comfort of your bed, imagine the tension within Carthage during this desperate time. The proud city that had ruled the Western Mediterranean for centuries now fighting for its very existence against those who had recently been its defenders. The streets would have been filled with nervous energy, the governing councils meeting in emergency session, while beyond the city walls, the flames of burning estates and farms marked the rebels' progress. In this crisis, Hamilcar Barca emerged as Carthage's savior. Despite being one of the generals whose troops had rebelled, though his own men had remained loyal, he was given command of the hastily assembled Carthaginian forces. Through brilliant tactical maneuvers, he gradually isolated and defeated the rebel groups, eventually trapping the main rebel army in a ravine called the Soar and annihilating them. By 237 BCE, after more than 3 years of brutal fighting, the rebellion was finally suppressed. The mercenary war left Carthage in a precarious position. Its African territories had been devastated, its finances were in even worse condition than immediately after the Punic War, and its reputation had suffered. Taking advantage of Carthage's weakness, Rome seized the islands of Sardinia and Corsica in 238 BCE territories not included in the original peace terms of 2041 BCE. When Carthage protested this violation of the treaty, Rome threatened renewed war, forcing the Carthaginians to not only accept the loss of these islands, but also to pay an additional indemnity. This opportunistic action by Rome, contrary to the terms of the recent peace, left a bitter legacy of resentment among Carthaginians. Facing this deteriorating situation, Carthage needed new sources of wealth and power to rebuild its strength. The solution came in the form of overseas expansion, not in the traditional areas of Sicily and Sardinia, now lost to Rome, but in the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal. Rich in silver mines and agricultural resources, Iberia offered opportunities to recoup Carthage's fortunes away from direct Roman interference. Hamilcar Barca, the the hero of the mercenary war and one of the few Carthaginian generals to emerge from the First Punic War with his reputation intact, was the natural choice to lead this Iberian venture. In 237 BCE, he crossed to southern Iberia with an army and began a systematic campaign of conquest and alliance building. This was not merely a military expedition, but a deliberate policy of creating a new territorial base for Carthage, one that would provide the resources needed to eventually challenge Rome again. As your consciousness drifts deeper towards sleep, picture the landscape of ancient Iberia: rugged mountains rich with silver veins, fertile valleys watered by rivers flowing to the Mediterranean, coastal plains where Greek and Phoenician colonies had already established trading posts. Into this diverse land came the Carthaginians under Hamilcar, bringing their advanced agricultural techniques, their commercial expertise, and their determination to build a new power base. For 8 years, Hamilcar campaigned successfully in Iberia, extending Carthaginian control and developing the region's resources, particularly its silver mines, which soon began producing substantial wealth. When he died in battle in 229 BCE, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair continued his work, founding the city of New Carthage, modern Cartagena, as the capital of Carthaginian Iberia, and further expanding their territory through diplomacy as much as warfare. Rome, observing this Carthaginian resurgence with concern, negotiated the Ebro Treaty with Hasdrubal in 226 BCE, establishing the river Ebro as the northern limit of Carthaginian expansion in Iberia. This agreement temporarily satisfied both powers. Rome prevented Carthaginian influence from approaching their allies in the Greek colony of Massilia, modern Marseille, while Carthage secured recognition of their control over the southern two-thirds of the peninsula. While Carthage was rebuilding through Iberian expansion, Rome was also extending its influence and consolidating its position as the dominant Mediterranean power. The years following the First Punic War saw Rome establish its system of provincial administration in Sicily, creating a template that would be used for future overseas territories. Sicily's fertile lands, particularly suited for grain production, became an important source of food for Rome's growing population. Rome also dealt with the challenge of administering newly acquired Sardinia and Corsica, which proved more difficult than Sicily. Indigenous resistance in the mountainous interiors of these islands persisted for years, requiring ongoing military campaigns. This experience gave Rome further practice in managing overseas territories and maintaining forces away from the Italian mainland for extended periods. In 229–228 BCE, Rome conducted its first campaign across the Adriatic Sea against Illyrian pirates who had been disrupting Italian trade. This brief but successful intervention established a Roman presence in the Balkans and brought Rome into more direct contact with the Greek world, including the Kingdom of Macedonia. Though modest in scale compared to the Punic War, this eastern expansion demonstrated Rome's growing confidence in projecting power beyond Italy's shores. Within Italy itself, Rome faced a serious threat from Gallic tribes in the north. In 225 BCE, a major Gallic invasion thrust deep into central Italy before being defeated at the Battle of Telamon. Following this victory, Rome launched a systematic campaign to subdue the Po Valley region, Gallia Cisalpina, extending Roman control to the natural alpine frontier of the Italian peninsula by 2020 BCE. This northern expansion secured Rome's position in Italy and prevented future Gallic invasions from threatening the heartland of Roman power. These years also saw significant internal developments within Roman society. The First Punic War had accelerated social and economic changes already underway, particularly the concentration of land ownership in fewer hands, as many small farmers, after years of military service, returned to find their farms in disrepair or debt. The war had also increased the importance of the commercial classes who had profited from military contracts and expanded trade opportunities. These social tensions would eventually contribute to the political conflicts of the late Republic, though they were not yet acute enough to seriously undermine Roman unity. Religiously and culturally, this period saw increasing Greek influence in Rome as contact with the Hellenistic world intensified. Greek literary forms were adapted by early Roman writers like Livius Andronicus and Naevius, while Greek philosophical ideas began to attract interest among the Roman elite. Yet Rome maintained its distinctive character, adapting foreign influences to its own cultural framework rather than simply imitating them. As night deepens around you and these historical patterns unfold in your imagination, Consider how the seeds of the Second Punic War were being sown during this period of apparent peace. Carthage's Iberian expansion under the Barca family was creating a new power base that could potentially challenge Rome. Rome's growing dominance in the Mediterranean and its opportunistic seizure of Sardinia and Corsica had left a legacy of Carthaginian resentment. The fundamental competition between these powers for control of the Western Mediterranean remained unresolved, merely temporarily paused by the Peace of Lutatius. In 221 BCE, Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a Celtic slave whose master he had executed. Command of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia passed to Hamilcar's son, Hannibal Barca, then only 25 years old, but already showing the military brilliance that would make him one of history's greatest generals. With this transition, the stage was set for the next act in the drama of Rome and Carthage, a conflict that would bring the Roman state to the brink of destruction and produce one of antiquity's most remarkable military campaigns. Hannibal had grown up in the aftermath of Carthage's defeat, witnessed the humiliation of the Sardinia incident, and according to legend, had been made to swear an oath by his father Hamilcar never to be a friend of Rome. Now in command of a well-trained army in Iberia, with access to the wealth of Spanish silver mines and a deep personal commitment to challenging Roman power, he would soon catalyze the renewal of the conflict between these Mediterranean giants. As you drift toward the deepest realms of sleep, the ancient world gradually fading from your conscious mind, know that when next we continue this historical journey, we will encounter one of history's most fascinating figures, Hannibal Barca, whose audacious strategy and tactical brilliance would test Rome as it had never been tested before, and whose name would echo through the centuries as one of Rome's greatest adversaries. As the night cradles you in its peaceful embrace, let us turn our attention to one of history's most fascinating and formidable military minds, Hannibal Barca, whose name would become synonymous with strategic brilliance and implacable determination. To understand the man who would bring Rome to the brink of destruction, we must first understand the forces that shaped him. For Hannibal was as much a product of his time and circumstances as he was an exceptional individual who transcended them. Born in 247 BCE in Carthage, Hannibal came into a world already defined by the ongoing struggle with Rome. His father, Hamilcar Barca, was one of Carthage's most capable generals during the First Punic War, who had maintained an undefeated guerrilla campaign in Sicily even as the larger conflict turned against his city. The surname Barca, meaning lightning or shining, reflected Hamilcar's swift and effective military style, a legacy his son would not only inherit but enhance. Hannibal's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War and the subsequent mercenary war that nearly destroyed the city. These formative experiences would have impressed upon the young boy both the consequences of failure and the fragility of even great powers when faced with existential threats. From his earliest years, Hannibal witnessed his father's efforts to rebuild Carthaginian strength and prestige after these devastating setbacks. The most famous story about Hannibal's youth comes from the Roman historian Livy, who describes how Hamilcar, before departing for his command in Spain in 2037 BCE, brought his 9-year-old son before an altar and made him swear an oath never to be a friend of Rome. Whether this dramatic scene occurred exactly as described, it captures a fundamental truth. Hannibal was raised to see Rome as Carthage's natural enemy, and his own life's mission as the restoration of his city's power against Roman encroachment. Imagine, as you rest in comfortable darkness, the scene of this solemn oath, a father and son before a sacred altar, the smell of incense hanging in the air, the weight of history and expectation passing from one generation to the next. Whether literal truth or symbolic narrative, this moment encapsulates how personal and national destinies became intertwined in Hannibal's life story. When Hamilcar departed for Spain, he took his young son with him, beginning Hannibal's practical education in warfare, diplomacy, and leadership. The Iberian campaign offered a perfect training ground for the future general. Here was a complex theatre of operations with diverse terrain, numerous indigenous peoples with whom alliances must be forged, and regular military engagements against both native resistance and occasional Roman allied forces. Under his father's tutelage, Hannibal learned not only tactics and strategy, but the equally important arts of leadership, how to inspire loyalty in diverse troops, how to negotiate with potential allies, how to manage the logistics of campaigning in difficult terrain. He observed firsthand how his father combined military action with diplomacy, using force when necessary, but preferring to win allies through negotiation and respect for local customs when possible. Hannibal's education was not limited to military matters. The Barcid family valued Greek culture and education, and Hannibal received comprehensive instruction in Greek language and literature, mathematics and philosophy. He was particularly drawn to the works of the Greek general Xenophon, especially the Anabasis, which described a famous march of Greek mercenaries through difficult terrain in Persia, and writings on leadership and horsemanship. This Greek education gave Hannibal a broader perspective than many of his contemporaries and tools for understanding his Roman adversaries, who were themselves increasingly influenced by Hellenistic culture. When Hamilcar died in battle in 229 BCE, command passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, who continued the Barcid policy of expanding Carthaginian control in Spain through a combination of military action and alliance building. During this period, the young Hannibal continued his apprenticeship in command, now leading cavalry units and distinguishing himself in various engagements. He developed a particular expertise in the use of mounted troops, learning from both Carthaginian traditions and the excellent indigenous horsemen of Spain. As you drift deeper towards sleep, picture the young Hannibal in these formative years, riding across the varied Spanish landscape, studying terrain with an increasingly expert eye, developing the skills of rapid assessment and decision-making that would later serve him so well in major battles. The hot Spanish sun tans his skin as he confers with native chieftains in their own languages, inspects silver mines that provide essential resources for Carthage, and leads cavalry maneuvers that grow increasingly complex and effective. Hannibal was also developing his remarkable ability to command the loyalty of diverse troops. The Carthaginian forces in Spain included not only Carthaginian citizens, but Libyans, Numidians, and various Iberian peoples, each with their own languages, fighting styles, and customs. Hannibal showed an exceptional talent for communicating effectively with these different groups, respecting their particular strengths and molding them into a cohesive fighting force. According to ancient sources, he shared the hardships of his men, slept among the common soldiers, and led from the front in battle qualities that inspired deep personal loyalty. This period also saw Hannibal developing his strategic thinking. The Barcid enterprise in Spain was not merely a series of military campaigns, but a long-term project to build a new power base for Carthage, one that required balancing immediate tactical objectives against broader political and economic goals. Hannibal would have observed how his father and brother-in-law managed these competing priorities, lessons that would inform his own approach to strategy once he assumed command. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, the troops in Spain acclaimed the 25-year-old Hannibal as their new commander, a choice subsequently confirmed by the authorities in Carthage. This smooth transition spoke to the young general's already established reputation among the soldiers and the strength of the Barcid faction in Carthaginian politics. Hannibal now had at his disposal a well-trained army of approximately 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, as well as the resources of a prosperous territorial base in southern and eastern Spain. From the beginning of his independent command, Hannibal showed both ambition and strategic clarity. He immediately launched campaigns against tribes in central Spain, extending Carthaginian control northward toward the Ebro River, which had been established as the boundary of Carthaginian influence by the treaty with Rome in 226 BCE. These campaigns served multiple purposes. They secured additional resources, demonstrated Hannibal's capabilities as a commander, and tested the limits of Roman tolerance for Carthaginian expansion. As your consciousness continues its gentle journey towards sleep, consider how Hannibal's early life had prepared him for the momentous decisions he would soon make. He had grown up in the shadow of Carthage's defeat and humiliation. He had been raised by a father committed to restoring Carthaginian power and explicitly opposed to Rome. He had received both practical military training and a broader intellectual education that gave him the tools to conceive and execute bold strategies. And he had inherited command of a capable, loyal army in a region rich with resources to support his ambitions. By 220 BCE, Hannibal was actively seeking a pretext for renewed conflict with Rome. He found his opportunity in the city of Saguntum, modern Sagunto, located south of the Ebro River but allied with Rome, an arrangement that created ambiguity about whether attacking it would violate the Ebro Treaty. When a dispute arose between Saguntum and neighboring tribes allied with Carthage, Hannibal seized the chance to intervene, laying siege to the city in 219 BCE. This decision was calculated to provoke a Roman response while technically remaining within the letter of the treaty, which prohibited Carthaginian forces from crossing the Ebro, not from attacking Roman allies south of it. The siege of Saguntum lasted 8 months, during which Rome sent ambassadors demanding that Hannibal withdraw, but did not send military assistance to their beleaguered ally. When Saguntum finally fell, the Romans sent a delegation to Carthage itself, presenting an ultimatum: surrender Hannibal and his officers or face war. The Carthaginian Senate, influenced by the Barcid faction and buoyed by Hannibal's successes in Spain, rejected the ultimatum. According to tradition, the Roman ambassador gathered his toga in a fold, saying, "Here we bring you peace and war, take which you will." When the Carthaginians replied that he should choose himself, he let fall the fold of his toga with the words, "Then take war." The Carthaginian spokesman responded, "We accept it and are determined to prosecute it with the same spirit with which we have accepted it." With this exchange, the Second Punic War officially began in 218 BCE. Hannibal, now 28 years old, had achieved his goal of renewing the conflict with Rome, but on terms of his own choosing and with significantly better preparation than Carthage had enjoyed at the outbreak of the First Punic War. He controlled a well-trained army, had access to the resources of Carthaginian Spain, and most importantly, had conceived a bold strategy that would take the war directly to Italian soil, a plan that would shock Rome and very nearly lead to its destruction. As you settle into the deepest phases of sleep, know that when we next continue this historical journey, we will follow Hannibal on one of history's most audacious military ventures, his crossing of the Alps and invasion of Italy, a campaign that would test the limits of human endurance and military leadership while bringing the Roman Republic face to face with the greatest threat it had ever encountered. As the night deepens around you and your mind settles into a more receptive state, let us examine the complex web of causes that led to the Second Punic War, a conflict that would prove far more dangerous to Rome than the first, and that would produce one of history's most remarkable military campaigns under Hannibal's leadership. The immediate trigger for the war was the siege and destruction of Saguntum by Hannibal in 219–218 BCE, but this event was merely the final step in a longer process of escalating tensions between Rome and Carthage. To truly understand why these Mediterranean powers returned to conflict less than a quarter century after their first exhausting war, we must look deeper into the structural causes and unresolved issues that made renewed hostilities almost inevitable. The Peace of Lutatius that ended the First Punic War in 241 BCE had established a temporary equilibrium rather than a lasting resolution to the competition between Rome and Carthage. While the treaty terms were clear regarding Sicily and war reparations, they did not address the fundamental question of spheres of influence in the Western Mediterranean. This ambiguity left room for friction as both powers continued to pursue their interests in the region. The Roman annexation of Sardinia and Corsica in 238 BCE, exploiting Carthage's weakness during the Mercenary War, added a bitter grievance to the existing tensions. This opportunistic action, accompanied by demands for additional indemnity when Carthage protested, was seen by many Carthaginians as a violation of the peace treaty and a demonstration of Roman bad faith. The resentment this generated, particularly among the Barcid faction, created an emotional foundation for future conflict. Carthage's subsequent expansion in Spain under Hamilcar Barca and his successors represented a strategic reorientation necessitated by the loss of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. With these traditional areas of influence now under Roman control, Carthage needed new sources of wealth and power to maintain its position as a major Mediterranean force. The rich silver mines and agricultural resources of the Iberian Peninsula offered an attractive alternative, and one initially distant enough from Roman interests to avoid immediate conflict. As you rest in comfortable darkness, imagine the strategic calculations taking place in both Rome and Carthage during these years between the wars. In Carthage, the Barcid faction argued for rebuilding strength through Spanish conquest, while in Rome, some senators watched this expansion with growing concern, recognizing that a resurgent Carthage might eventually challenge Roman dominance again. The air in council chambers on both sides of the Mediterranean would have been thick with debate, as competing factions argued about how to interpret and respond to the other powers' actions. The Ebro Treaty of 226 BCE represented an attempt to establish clearer boundaries between Roman and Carthaginian spheres of influence in Spain. Under this agreement, negotiated between Rome and Hasdrubal the Fair, Carthage agreed not to expand militarily north of the Ebro River, while Rome implicitly recognized Carthaginian predominance south of this boundary. This temporary compromise satisfied immediate concerns on both sides, but left significant ambiguities that would later be exploited. One such ambiguity concerned the status of Saguntum, a city located south of the Ebro but allied with Rome before the treaty was signed. The treaty did not explicitly address whether Rome could maintain alliances with cities within the Carthaginian sphere, nor whether such alliances would protect these cities from Carthaginian action. This diplomatic grey area would provide Hannibal with his pretext for war. When Hannibal assumed command of Carthaginian forces in Spain in 221 BCE, he brought to his position not only exceptional military talent, but a personal and ideological commitment to challenging Rome. Raised from childhood to view Rome as Carthage's natural enemy and reportedly sworn to enmity by his father Hamilcar, Hannibal saw renewed conflict not as a risk to be avoided, but as a necessary step in restoring Carthaginian greatness and avenging past humiliations. The siege of Saguntum, which began in 219 BCE, was carefully calculated to provoke a Roman response while maintaining technical adherence to the Ebro Treaty. When disputes arose between Saguntum and neighboring tribes allied with Carthage, Hannibal seized the opportunity to intervene. The ensuing siege lasted 8 months, during which Rome sent diplomatic protests but no military assistance to their ally, a failure that would later cause recriminations in Rome. As your body grows heavier with approaching sleep, consider the diplomatic exchanges that must have occurred during these tense months. Messengers hurrying between Spain, Rome, and Carthage. Formal embassies delivering carefully worded protests and replies. Reports from observers trickling back to decision-makers in both capitals. The machinery of ancient diplomacy worked slowly by modern standards, but the stakes were just as high as in any contemporary international crisis. When Saguntum finally fell in early 218 BCE, Rome sent an embassy to Carthage with an ultimatum: surrender Hannibal and his officers for punishment, or face war. This demand, which would have required Carthage to abandon its most successful general and implicitly accept Roman authority to dictate Carthaginian policy, was almost certainly designed to be rejected. The Carthaginian Senate, influenced by the Barcid faction's successes and unwilling to submit to such humiliation, chose war. This sequence of events raises the question of responsibility for the conflict. Roman sources naturally placed blame squarely on Hannibal and Carthage, portraying the attack on Saguntum as an unprovoked aggression against a Roman ally. Modern historians have taken more varied views. Some see Hannibal as the primary instigator, deliberately engineering a conflict to fulfill his personal vendetta against Rome. Others emphasize Roman provocations, particularly the annexation of Sardinia and Corsica, and Rome's ambiguous policy of forming alliances within the recognized Carthaginian sphere of influence in Spain. Perhaps most convincing is the view that the Second Punic War stemmed from deeper structural causes that made continued peaceful coexistence difficult for these two expanding powers. The Western Mediterranean was not large enough to accommodate two ambitious states without clear agreements about spheres of influence, agreements that neither side was fully prepared to make or honor. In this interpretation, particular events like the Saguntum crisis were symptoms rather than causes of an underlying geopolitical rivalry. Beyond these specific issues, cultural and ideological factors may have contributed to the conflict. Rome and Carthage represented different models of state organization and expansion. Rome's system emphasized political integration of conquered peoples through various forms of citizenship and alliance, creating an expanding network of communities with a stake in Roman success. Carthage's traditional approach had been commercial dominance rather than territorial control, though this was changing with its Spanish expansion under the Barcids. These different models created contrasting strengths and vulnerabilities. Rome could mobilize enormous manpower from its Italian allies, while Carthage possessed greater financial resources and maritime expertise. Neither side fully understood or respected the other's system, leading to miscalculations about how the opponent would respond to challenges and setbacks. As the diplomatic crisis over Saguntum escalated toward war, both sides made strategic calculations that would shape the coming conflict. Rome planned a two-pronged offensive. One consul would lead an army to Spain to engage Hannibal directly, while another would invade North Africa to threaten Carthage itself. Essentially, the strategy that had eventually brought success in the First Punic War. This conventional approach assumed that Hannibal would remain in Spain to defend Carthaginian holdings there. Hannibal, however, had conceived a far bolder plan. Rather than waiting to receive the Roman attack in Spain or defending Carthage's African homeland, he would take the war directly to Italy, striking at the heart of Roman power. By invading the Italian peninsula, he hoped to break apart Rome's network of allies, who might abandon the Roman cause if it appeared to be losing. This strategy recognized that Rome's greatest strength was its ability to draw on the manpower of its Italian confederation. A system that might prove fragile if subjected to sufficient pressure. As night embraces you completely, and these ancient strategies unfold in your imagination, consider how Hannibal's bold approach represented a profound understanding of his opponent's center of gravity. Rather than fighting the kind of war Rome expected and was prepared for, he would create an entirely different conflict, one that would test the foundations of Roman power and resolve. The stage was now set for one of history's most dramatic military campaigns. As the diplomatic exchanges hardened into declarations of war in 218 BCE, Hannibal was already preparing his army in Spain for an unprecedented march across southern Europe. His target, the Italian peninsula itself, where he would bring war to Roman territory for the first time since the early days of the Republic, challenging Rome in a way no enemy had done before. The causes of the Second Punic War were complex, rooted in unresolved issues from the previous conflict, strategic competition for influence in the Western Mediterranean, personal factors like Hannibal's oath of enmity, and the structural tensions between two expanding powers. But whatever the precise mixture of causes, the results would be momentous. A conflict that would see Rome brought to the brink of destruction before ultimately emerging more powerful than ever, and that would produce military campaigns still studied for their strategic and tactical brilliance more than 2 millennia later. As you drift toward the deepest realms of sleep, know that when next we continue this historical journey, we will follow Hannibal on his audacious march from Spain to Italy, a journey across rivers, mountains, and hostile territories that would become legendary even before he faced a single Roman army in battle. In the quiet darkness that surrounds you, let your mind travel back more than 2,000 years to one of history's most audacious military ventures, Hannibal's legendary crossing of the Alps. This remarkable journey, undertaken in the autumn of 218 BCE, would secure Hannibal's place in history even before his subsequent victories against Roman armies. It stands as a testament to human determination, leadership, and the capacity to achieve what most deemed impossible. After the declaration of war following the fall of Saguntum, Hannibal moved with decisive speed. The Romans, expecting a conventional conflict, had prepared to send one consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, with an army to Spain to engage Hannibal directly, while the other consul would lead forces to Sicily and then North Africa to attack Carthage itself. This strategy assumed Hannibal would remain in Spain to defend Carthaginian territories there. The Carthaginian general, however, had entirely different plans. In late spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal gathered his forces at New Carthage, modern Cartagena, the administrative capital of Carthaginian Spain. His army numbered approximately 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants, a multinational force including Carthaginians, various African troops, and numerous Iberian warriors. Before departing, he made careful arrangements for the defense of Spain and North Africa, leaving his brother Hasdrubal with significant forces to maintain Carthaginian control in Iberia, and sending some Spanish troops to bolster defenses in Africa. As your body relaxes deeply into rest, imagine the scene at New Carthage as the army prepared for departure. The harbors bustling with supply ships, quartermasters checking provisions, officers reviewing maps and discussing routes, soldiers saying farewell to wives and children who had accompanied them in Spain. There is an air of anticipation and uncertainty. The men know they are embarking on an extraordinary venture, but few can envision the full scope of challenges that await them. The first stage of the journey took Hannibal's army north along the Spanish coast and across the Ebro River, entering territory beyond the boundary established by the treaty with Rome. This move immediately altered the strategic situation, as it meant Hannibal was no longer defending Carthaginian Spain, but advancing into areas where Rome had established alliances. The crossing of the Ebro also required fighting, as some local tribes allied with Rome opposed the Carthaginian advance. After securing the territory between the Ebro and the Pyrenees, and leaving a subordinate named Hanno with 10,000 troops to control this newly conquered region, Hannibal continued north with his main force. Crossing the Pyrenees Mountains presented the first major natural barrier of the campaign. While not as formidable as the Alps that still lay ahead, these mountains required careful management of troops and supplies, especially as some Iberian soldiers, reluctant to leave their homeland for such a distant campaign, deserted during this phase of the journey. Upon descending from the Pyrenees into southern Gaul, modern France, Hannibal's army numbered approximately 46,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Still a formidable force, but already somewhat reduced by combat, garrison requirements, and desertion. In Gaul, Hannibal faced the complex task of navigating through territories controlled by various Celtic tribes, some hostile, some neutral, some potentially friendly to his cause due to their own conflicts with expanding Roman influence. As you drift deeper towards sleep, picture Hannibal's army making its way through the landscapes of southern Gaul, columns of soldiers winding along river valleys, cavalry scouts ranging ahead to assess routes and potential threats, supply wagons creaking under their loads, and the exotic war elephants creating astonishment among local populations who had never seen such creatures. The late summer sun beats down on men from Africa and Spain, accustomed to heat, but now marching steadily toward colder climes as autumn approaches and their path bends toward the Alps. Hannibal demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill during this phase of the journey, negotiating passage through tribal territories, sometimes paying for safe conduct, sometimes impressing local chiefs with displays of strength, always seeking to minimize unnecessary conflict that would deplete his forces before reaching Italy. When fighting could not be avoided, as with some tribes near the Rhone River, he deployed his troops effectively, maintaining the army's cohesion and fighting capability. The crossing of the Rhone itself presented a major logistical challenge. This wide, swift river required careful planning to transport not only thousands of men, but also horses, pack animals, and elephants. Hannibal's engineers constructed rafts for the troops, and larger, sturdier vessels for the elephants, which were either floated across directly or coaxed to swim, depending on the ancient account. Some elephants reportedly became frightened mid-crossing and jumped into the river, using their trunks as natural snorkels while walking along the riverbed, a detail that captures both the practical difficulties and the almost mythical quality this expedition had, even in ancient accounts. It was near the Rhone crossing that Hannibal narrowly avoided a direct confrontation with Roman forces. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the consul dispatched to Spain, had stopped at Massilia, modern Marseille, and learned to his surprise that Hannibal had already crossed the Pyrenees and was moving through Gaul. Scipio sent a cavalry detachment to reconnoiter, which briefly skirmished with Carthaginian scouts. Realizing he had misjudged Hannibal's strategy, Scipio sent most of his army onto Spain under his brother's command, while he himself returned to Italy to prepare defenses against the coming invasion. After crossing the Rhone, Hannibal made a crucial decision that has been debated by historians and military analysts ever since. Rather than taking the easier coastal route into Italy, which would have exposed his army to interception by Roman forces, he chose to march inland toward the High Alps. This more difficult path would bring him into northern Italy through an unexpected direction, potentially achieving strategic surprise and allowing him to make contact with Gallic tribes in the Po Valley who had only recently been subjugated by Rome and might be willing to support his campaign. As autumn progressed and Hannibal's army approached the towering Alpine peaks, the challenges intensified dramatically. The weather grew colder, the terrain more difficult, and some of the mountain tribes actively hostile. These tribes employed guerrilla tactics, well suited to their home territory, rolling boulders down on the Carthaginian column from above and attacking vulnerable points in the line of march. As your consciousness hovers between wakefulness and dreams, imagine the increasingly difficult conditions as Hannibal's army ascended into the Alps in October 218 BCE. The air grows thin and cold, the soldier's breath visible in the chill mountain dawn. Paths narrow until men and animals must proceed in single file along precipitous routes where a misstep means death. Snow begins to appear at higher elevations, first as occasional patches, then as a consistent covering that conceals the path and creates treacherous footing. The sounds of the march change too. The metallic clink of equipment mixes with the labored breathing of men and animals in the thin mountain air, the creaking of frozen leather, and sometimes the rumble of distant avalanches or the shouts of hostile tribesmen echoing across valleys. Hannibal's leadership proved crucial during this most difficult phase of the journey. According to ancient accounts, he remained visible to his troops, sharing their hardships, encouraging the exhausted, sometimes leading from the front to show the way, other times staying with the rear guard to ensure no one was left behind. When hostile tribes blocked narrow passes, he demonstrated tactical flexibility, feigning retreat at one point, then sending forces to secure higher ground overnight before clearing the path forward at dawn. One of the most famous episodes of the crossing involved a section of the path that had been blocked by a landslide. Ancient sources describe how Hannibal's men had to build a new path along the mountainside, a massive engineering effort made even more difficult by the need to create a route wide enough for the elephants. The most detailed account, by Livy, describes how they cut down large trees, built a huge fire against a rock face, then poured vinegar on the heated rock to make it crack, allowing them to carve a zigzag path down the mountain. Modern historians debate the accuracy of this particular detail, but the general challenge of creating paths suitable for such a large and diverse military force in alpine conditions remains impressive, regardless of the specific techniques employed. The human and animal cost of the alpine crossing was severe. Cold, exhaustion, treacherous terrain, and attacks by hostile tribes steadily reduced the army's numbers. The elephants, native to much warmer climates, suffered particularly badly in the mountain conditions, though most survived the crossing itself. Polybius, drawing on a now-lost inscription that Hannibal himself had placed in southern Italy, recorded that by the time the army descended into the Po Valley, it had been reduced to 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, less than half the force that had departed from New Carthage. Yet despite these losses, the core of Hannibal's army remained intact and combat effective. The shared ordeal of the Alpine crossing had forged an even stronger bond between the general and his men, creating the kind of fierce loyalty that would serve Hannibal well in the campaigns to come. Those who survived emerged with justified confidence in their own capabilities and their leader's judgment, even when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. After 15 days in the mountains, Hannibal's army finally descended into the Po Valley of northern Italy in November 218 BCE. The strategic surprise he had sought was achieved. His appearance from the Alps astonished the Romans, who had expected to fight the war in Spain and North Africa, not on Italian soil. Before the Republic could fully respond to this unexpected threat, Hannibal secured his position by winning over many of the recently conquered Gallic tribes of the region, who saw in the Carthaginian arrival an opportunity to regain their independence from Rome. As you sink into the deepest phase of sleep, consider the remarkable achievement this crossing represented. In an age without modern maps, weather forecasting, or mountaineering equipment, Hannibal had led a diverse army, including cavalry and elephants, across one of Europe's most formidable mountain ranges at the onset of winter. The journey, covering approximately 500 miles, 2,400 kilometers from New Carthage to the Po Valley, had taken 5 months and cost his army dearly in numbers. Yet the core of the force remained intact and the strategic position achieved, appearing unexpectedly in northern Italy with a veteran army while local Gallic tribes rallied to his cause, created an opportunity for the series of victories that would soon shake Rome to its foundations. The Alpine crossing also secured Hannibal's place in history, regardless of the war's eventual outcome. Even his Roman enemies acknowledged the extraordinary nature of this achievement. Centuries later, the Roman poet Juvenal would write of Hannibal breaking through the Alps and rending the mountains with vinegar, while the statesman Cicero called him the most prudent of generals. The crossing became legendary even in antiquity, and has remained one of history's great examples of military leadership, strategic vision, and human endurance against seemingly insurmountable natural obstacles. As you rest in peaceful slumber, know that when next we continue this historical journey, we will follow Hannibal's remarkable campaign in Italy, where his tactical brilliance would win a series of victories against Roman armies that threatened the very existence of the Republic. The general who had achieved the impossible by crossing the Alps would soon prove equally formidable on the battlefield, creating a crisis that would test Roman resolve as never before. As your consciousness drifts in the peaceful realm between wakefulness and dreams, let us follow Hannibal's extraordinary campaign in northern Italy, where he would demonstrate tactical brilliance that continues to be studied in military academies to this day. Having accomplished the seemingly impossible feat of crossing the Alps, the Carthaginian general now faced the challenge of defeating Rome's legions on their home territory, a task no foreign general had accomplished since the Gallic sack of Rome more than 70 years earlier. When Hannibal descended from the Alps into the Po Valley in November of 218 BCE, his army was significantly diminished by the arduous crossing but remained a formidable fighting force. His first priority was to rest his troops and allow them to recover from the hardships of the mountain journey. The mild climate of the Po Valley, compared to the Alpine heights, provided welcome relief, while the fertile countryside offered abundant provisions after weeks of limited supplies. Equally important was securing local support. The region of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, had only recently been brought under Roman control, and many of the Celtic tribes harbored resentment against their new masters. Hannibal, who had studied his potential theatre of operations carefully, knew these tribes might become valuable allies if he could demonstrate that he posed a credible threat to Roman power. His arrival from an unexpected direction with a veteran army provided exactly the opportunity many Gallic leaders had been waiting for. Initial diplomatic overtures met with mixed results. Some tribes remained cautious, watching to see whether this foreign general could actually defeat Roman forces before committing to his cause. Others, particularly the Insubres and Boii, who had most recently felt the weight of Roman expansion, quickly offered alliance. These early Celtic allies provided Hannibal with essential local knowledge, supplies, and additional manpower, particularly cavalry and light infantry that would complement his existing forces. As you settle more deeply into relaxation, imagine the scene in the Po Valley during these early weeks of the campaign. Hannibal's multinational army establishes camps along the river, with sentries keeping watchful eyes toward the south, where Roman forces will eventually appear. Diplomatic exchanges occurred daily as representatives from various Gallic tribes arrived to assess this unexpected potential ally. In the camps, soldiers care for equipment damaged during the Alpine crossing, cavalry exercise their mounts in the open plains, and the surviving war elephants. Exotic beasts never before seen in these lands create wonder among local inhabitants. The first significant military engagement of the Italian campaign came at the Ticinus River, modern Ticino, a tributary of the Po. The Roman consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had returned from Massilia to organize the defense of northern Italy, advanced with a reconnaissance force to assess Hannibal's strength and intentions. What resulted was primarily a cavalry engagement, as the forward elements of both armies encountered each other in the rolling countryside. This battle, though relatively small in scale, revealed Hannibal's tactical acumen and the superior quality of his cavalry. The Numidian and Spanish horsemen outmaneuvered and overwhelmed the Roman cavalry, inflicting significant casualties and wounding Scipio himself, who was only saved from capture or death by the bravery of his teenage son, the future Scipio Africanus, who would eventually defeat Hannibal. The Romans were forced to retreat, and this initial victory enhanced Hannibal's prestige among the Gallic tribes, bringing more of them into his alliance. Following this success, Hannibal advanced toward the Trebia River, where the second Roman consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, had arrived with additional forces to join Scipio. The combined Roman army now significantly outnumbered Hannibal's forces, but the Carthaginian general saw an opportunity to use both terrain and psychology to his advantage. As the December days grew shorter and colder, Hannibal carefully selected his battleground along the Trebia, a river with steep banks that could be crossed but would disrupt Roman formations. He placed his brother Mago with a select force of 2,000 infantry in concealed positions near the battlefield, then executed a plan that demonstrated his deep understanding of his opponent's temperament. Knowing that Sempronius was eager for battle and glory before his term as consul ended, Hannibal sent a small cavalry force to harass the Roman camp at dawn, then feign retreat. As anticipated, Sempronius ordered immediate pursuit without allowing his men breakfast or adequate preparation. The Roman soldiers crossed the cold waters of the Trebia in winter, arriving at the battlefield already chilled, hungry, and somewhat disorganized, to find Hannibal's army well fed, rested, and properly deployed for battle. As your body grows heavier with approaching sleep, Envision the Battle of the Trebia unfolding on a cold December morning in 2118 BCE. A thin winter mist hangs over the river as thousands of Roman legionaries splash through the chest, high water, their skin prickling with cold. On the opposite bank, Hannibal's troops have enjoyed warm fires, a proper meal, and even oil to rub on their bodies against the chill small advantages that can make significant differences in combat effectiveness. The battle began conventionally enough, with both sides deploying their infantry in the center and cavalry on the wings. However, Hannibal's superior cavalry quickly gained the advantage on both flanks, while his light infantry and elephants disrupted the Roman formations. As the battle reached its critical phase, Mago's hidden force emerged from concealment to attack the Roman rear, creating panic and confusion. Caught between multiple threats, the Roman army began to disintegrate. Only the discipline of the Roman legionaries prevented complete destruction. A corps of about 10,000 men maintained formation and fought their way clear of the encirclement, eventually reaching the nearby town of Placentia, modern Piacenza. The remainder of the Roman force was killed or captured, giving Hannibal his first major victory on Italian soil. Coming so soon after his Alpine crossing, this success established him as a commander of extraordinary capability and secured him even broader support among the Gallic tribes. The Battle of the Trebia demonstrated several hallmarks of Hannibal's generalship that would reappear throughout his campaign: careful selection of terrain, psychological manipulation of his opponents, effective use of ambush and surprise, and the skilled integration of different troop types, cavalry, infantry, elephants, into a coherent battle plan. These qualities made him particularly dangerous to Roman generals trained in a more straightforward, force-against-force tradition of warfare. After wintering in northern Italy and allowing his troops to recover fully from the Alpine crossing, Hannibal prepared to advance into central Italy in the spring of 217 BCE. He faced a strategic choice. The direct route south led through mountain passes that could easily be defended, while an alternative path through the marshes of the Arno River Valley was difficult but might achieve surprise. Characteristically, Hannibal chose the more challenging route that offered strategic advantage, leading his army through the marshes despite the hardships this imposed. The march through the Arno marshes proved costly. Men trudged for days through waist-deep water and sucking mud, unable to find dry ground for rest. Disease spread through the army, and many pack animals died. Hannibal himself developed an eye infection that eventually cost him sight in one eye. Yet the strategic gambit succeeded. The army emerged from the marshes into Etruria, modern Tuscany, having bypassed Roman defensive positions in the mountain passes. As you drift deeper towards sleep, imagine the discomfort of this marsh crossing, the constant squelching of mud underfoot, the damp that penetrates clothing and equipment, the inability to find dry ground for fires or rest. Yet Hannibal's men persist, their confidence in their leader unshaken even through this miserable experience. Their reward comes when they emerge onto dry land and find themselves behind Roman defensive positions, once again having achieved strategic surprise through willingness to endure hardship. The new Roman commander, Consul Gaius Flaminius, had positioned his army to defend the mountain passes and was taken aback when Hannibal appeared from the marshes and began ravaging the rich countryside of Etruria. Impetuous and concerned about political criticism if he allowed such devastation to continue, Flaminius pursued the Carthaginian army without waiting for his colleagues' forces to join him. Exactly the reaction Hannibal had anticipated and desired. The stage was now set for one of history's most perfect ambushes at Lake Trasimene. Hannibal identified an ideal location where the road ran along a narrow strip of land between the lake and steep, wooded hills. As Flaminius pursued the Carthaginian army, apparently retreating before him, Hannibal positioned his troops in concealment along these hills, waiting for the entire Roman column to enter the trap before springing it. On a misty morning in June 217 BCE, the Roman army marched along the lakeshore, unable to see more than a short distance in any direction due to the fog. When the entire column had entered the narrow passage, Hannibal gave a signal. Suddenly, Carthaginian forces attacked from all sides, emerging from the mist to strike a Roman army strung out along the road and unable to form proper battle lines. The surprise was so complete that many Romans were driven into the lake and drowned, weighed down by their armor. Flaminius himself was killed, and his army virtually annihilated, with perhaps 15,000 Romans dead and a similar number captured. The Battle of Lake Trasimene demonstrated Hannibal's mastery of terrain and his genius for turning apparent disadvantages into advantages. The morning mist, which might have complicated military operations for a conventional commander, became an essential element of his ambush plan, concealing his forces until the perfect moment. His understanding of his opponent's psychology, once again, led Flaminius into a trap from which there was no escape. And the coordination required to position thousands of troops in concealment, maintain silence until the signal, and then attack simultaneously from multiple directions showed exceptional command and control. This second major victory within 6 months sent shockwaves through the Roman Republic. For the first time in living memory, Rome faced an enemy general who seemed able to outthink and outfight their best commanders, operating successfully on Italian soil, where no foreign army had campaigned effectively since the early days of the Republic. Political and psychological crisis accompanied military defeat, as Romans wondered whether their traditional institutions and methods could withstand this unprecedented threat. Rome's response was to appoint Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a temporary emergency position with extraordinary powers. Fabius adopted a strategy that would later bear his name, the Fabian strategy, of avoiding direct confrontation with Hannibal while shadowing his movements, harassing his foraging parties, and gradually wearing down his forces through attrition. This approach recognized that Hannibal's greatest strengths were his tactical brilliance in open battle and his ability to inspire his troops to extraordinary feats. By refusing pitched battle, Fabius denied Hannibal opportunities to use these advantages. As the warm summer night embraces you and ancient battles unfold in your imagination, picture the frustration Hannibal must have felt as his army marched through the rich Italian countryside, with Roman forces visible on nearby hills but refusing to descend and give battle. His strategic position was simultaneously strong and precarious, victorious in every major engagement, yet unable to force a decisive conclusion to the war. Far from his bases of supply in Spain and North Africa, dependent on local allies whose loyalty might waver if he could not maintain his momentum. Fabius's strategy, while militarily sound, proved politically unpopular in Rome. Romans were accustomed to directly confronting their enemies, and watching Hannibal ravage Italian farmlands without challenge seemed cowardly to many citizens. Fabius was mockingly called the Delayer, and when his 6-month term as dictator ended, the Romans reverted to more aggressive leadership under the consuls elected for 216 BCE, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. These new commanders assembled the largest army Rome had ever fielded, 8 legions plus allies, perhaps 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, and sought the decisive battle that Fabius had avoided. Hannibal, with his genius for understanding his opponents, provided exactly the opportunity they desired, positioning his smaller force of approximately 50,000 in a location that virtually guaranteed the Romans would attack: the plain near the town of Cannae in Apulia, southeastern Italy. The Battle of Cannae, fought in early August 216 BCE, would become Hannibal's masterpiece and one of history's most studied military engagements. The battlefield was a flat plain with the Aufidus River on one flank, offering little natural advantage to either side. Hannibal's deployment appeared conventional at first glance, but contained a subtle innovation rather than the usual straight line. His center infantry were arranged in a convex formation that protruded toward the Romans, with his strongest troops, African infantry with captured Roman equipment, positioned on the flanks rather than in the center, as was customary. As combat began and Roman infantry pushed forward against the Carthaginian center, this convex formation gradually gave way, transforming into a concave pocket that continued to withdraw under pressure. Rather than a collapsing front, this was a deliberate tactic. The center was sacrificing ground to absorb the weight of the Roman advance while maintaining cohesion. As the Romans pressed forward into this developing pocket, their flanks became exposed. At the critical moment, Hannibal's cavalry, having defeated their Roman counterparts on both wings, swung around to attack the Roman infantry from the rear, while his African infantry pivoted inward from the flanks. The result was a double envelopment, with the Roman army completely surrounded, packed so densely that many soldiers could not even raise their arms to defend themselves. The slaughter that followed was unprecedented. Ancient sources claim up to 70,000 Romans were killed, including 80 senators and one of the consuls, Aemilius Paulus. It ranks among the deadliest single days of combat in all military history. Cannae represented the perfect execution of Hannibal's approach to warfare, using psychological understanding of his opponents to draw them into a position of apparent advantage that was actually a carefully laid trap, employing terrain and tactical innovation to overcome numerical disadvantage, and coordinating infantry, cavalry, and allied troops in a complex battle plan that required precise timing and execution. The double envelopment he achieved has been studied by military commanders ever since, from Scipio Africanus, who would eventually defeat Hannibal using lessons learned from him, to modern generals of the industrial age. The strategic impact of Cannae was enormous. Coming after Trebia and Trasimene, this third consecutive crushing defeat seemed to confirm Hannibal's invincibility on the battlefield. Several Italian cities and regions that had been Roman allies for generations now defected to the Carthaginian side, most notably Capua, one of the largest cities in Italy. Syracuse in Sicily also abandoned its Roman alliance, and Hannibal negotiated a treaty with King Philip V of Macedonia, creating a potential second front for Rome to defend. The Republic faced the greatest crisis in its history, with enemies on multiple fronts and its military confidence shattered. As your consciousness drifts toward the deepest phases of sleep, consider the extraordinary position Hannibal had achieved by the late summer of 216 BCE. In less than 2 years, he had crossed the Alps against all expectations, won 3 major battles against progressively larger Roman armies, and created a strategic crisis that threatened Rome's position as the dominant power in Italy. He had demonstrated tactical genius that outmaneuvered the best Roman commanders, and inspired such loyalty among his troops that they followed him through incredible hardships without significant desertion. Yet despite these remarkable successes, the ultimate prize, Rome itself, remained elusive. Hannibal chose not to march on the city immediately after Cannae, a decision that has been debated by historians ever since. Perhaps he recognized that his army, though victorious, was too small to successfully besiege Rome's formidable defenses. Perhaps he believed his strategic goal could be better achieved by continuing to detach Rome's allies, isolating the city politically rather than attacking it directly. Whatever his reasoning, this decision marked a turning point in the war, as Rome would gradually recover from the shock of Cannae and adapt its strategy to neutralize Hannibal's greatest strengths. The story of this Roman resilience and adaptation, and of Hannibal's continued campaign in Italy against increasing odds, will be our focus when next we continue this historical journey. But for now, as sleep embraces you completely, let the echoes of these ancient battles fade into peaceful darkness, knowing that even in defeat, the seeds of Rome's eventual recovery were already being sown. As the night deepens around you and your body surrenders to restful comfort, let us explore one of history's most remarkable examples of national resilience: the Roman response to Hannibal's devastating victories. After the catastrophe at Cannae in 216 BCE, many ancient states would have sued for peace, accepting defeat in the face of such overwhelming military disasters. Rome, however, chose a different path, one that would eventually lead not only to recovery but to ultimate victory in the war. The immediate aftermath of Cannae was a period of profound crisis for the Roman Republic. The scale of the defeat, perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 Roman and allied soldiers killed or captured in a single day, was unprecedented. To put this in perspective, Rome had lost more men in one afternoon than many ancient cities had in their entire adult male population. Among the dead were 80 senators, one of the consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, numerous former magistrates, and thousands of equites, the wealthy class below senatorial rank. The human and leadership losses were staggering. Beyond the military disaster, Rome faced a political crisis as allies began to reconsider their loyalty. Most significantly, Capua, one of the largest and wealthiest cities in Italy, defected to Hannibal's side. Other communities in southern Italy, parts of Apulia, Samnium, Lucania, and Bruttium, also abandoned the Roman alliance. In Sicily, Syracuse renounced its treaty with Rome and aligned with Carthage. Meanwhile, King Philip V of Macedonia, seeing an opportunity in Rome's weakness, negotiated an alliance with Hannibal that threatened to open a second front in the war. As you rest in peaceful darkness, imagine the atmosphere in Rome during these dark days, the city in mourning for its fallen sons, messengers arriving with news of further defections, senators meeting in emergency session to address a crisis unlike any in living memory. The very foundations of Roman power in Italy, built over generations, seemed to be crumbling in a matter of months. Yet amid this crisis, certain qualities of Roman character and institutions became evident that would ultimately enable their recovery. The Senate, despite losing a significant portion of its membership at Cannae, maintained its function as the central deliberative body guiding state policy. New members were appointed to replace the fallen, and leadership emerged from those who remained. The constitutional system, though strained by emergency measures, continued to operate. Perhaps most remarkably, Rome refused to consider peace negotiations despite the series of catastrophic defeats. When Carthaginian envoys arrived with Roman prisoners hoping to arrange a ransom exchange and potentially open peace talks, they were not even permitted to enter the city. This uncompromising stance reflected a deep-seated Roman belief in their own ultimate destiny and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat that would characterize their approach to the remainder of the war. Instead of seeking peace, Rome mobilized its remaining resources with grim determination. New legions were raised, including some composed of slaves promised freedom for military service, an extraordinary measure reflecting the desperate circumstances. Young men below the normal military age were conscripted, and debts were incurred to finance the war effort. Equipment captured in previous generations' conflicts was taken from temples where it had been displayed as trophies and reissued to new recruits. Symbolically, the Romans enacted severe measures to emphasize the gravity of their situation and the need for unity. Mourning for the dead of Cannae was limited by decree to 30 days for women, after which normal civic life was to resume. Public displays of grief were discouraged as detrimental to morale. These psychological measures helped the population absorb the shock of defeat and turn their attention to continued resistance rather than dwelling on losses. As your body settles deeper into relaxation, consider how this combination of institutional resilience, ideological commitment, and practical measures allowed Rome to weather the immediate crisis. The Republic bent, but did not break under pressures that might have shattered other ancient states. This capacity for absorbing devastating blows while maintaining core functions would prove crucial in the long struggle against Hannibal. Militarily, the Romans gradually adapted their strategy to neutralize Hannibal's greatest strengths. Returning to elements of the Fabian approach that had been abandoned before Cannae, they now avoided pitched battles with Hannibal's main army, focusing instead on containing his movements, harassing his foraging parties, and gradually reclaiming territories that had defected. Multiple Roman armies operated in Italy, shadowing Hannibal's forces but refusing decisive engagement except under the most favorable circumstances. This strategic adjustment required significant psychological adaptation for a martial culture that traditionally valued direct confrontation. The Romans had to accept that conventional approaches would not work against a general of Hannibal's caliber, at least until they had developed new tactical methods and trained commanders capable of implementing them. This pragmatic recognition of reality, setting aside traditional preferences for military conduct in favor of what worked, demonstrated another aspect of Roman adaptability. Leadership during this period came from several notable figures. Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose cautious approach had been mockingly labeled the Fabian strategy before Cannae, now saw his methods vindicated and was elected to multiple consulships in the war's middle phase. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, known as the Sword of Rome, to complement Fabius's nickname, the Shield, provided more aggressive leadership where circumstances permitted, conducting successful operations in Sicily and southern Italy. Together, these commanders and others implemented a coordinated strategy that gradually reduced Hannibal's freedom of action without risking another catastrophic defeat. As night cradles you in its peaceful embrace, picture these Roman armies moving carefully through the Italian landscape, maintaining distance from Hannibal's main force, striking at isolated detachments, securing walled towns that could deny him supplies and shelter, and slowly, methodically, reclaiming control of the peninsula. There is none of the glory or drama of great pitched battles, but rather the patient, determined application of superior resources in a war of attrition that Hannibal, far from his bases of supply, could not ultimately win. One of Rome's most effective adaptations was to recognize that the war would be decided not only in Italy, but across multiple theaters of operation. While containing Hannibal on the peninsula, They committed significant resources to campaigns in Spain, Sicily, and eventually Africa. This global strategic approach leveraged Rome's superior manpower and resource base, forcing Carthage to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. In Spain, where Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal maintained Carthaginian control and attempted to gather reinforcements for the Italian campaign, Rome dispatched the brothers Publius and Gnaeus Scipio. Operating far from their home bases with limited support, these commanders nonetheless achieved significant successes between 218–212 BCE, preventing the flow of Spanish resources and manpower to Hannibal. When both Scipios were eventually killed in battle in 211 BCE, Rome quickly sent reinforcements under the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the earlier commander and future Scipio Africanus, demonstrating their commitment to this crucial theatre. In Sicily, the defection of Syracuse required a major Roman effort to regain control of the island. Marcus Claudius Marcellus conducted a difficult siege of Syracuse from 214–214 BCE, eventually capturing the city despite innovative defensive mechanisms designed by the mathematician Archimedes. By 2010 BCE, Rome had largely restored its control over Sicily, securing this vital grain-producing region and eliminating a potential base for Carthaginian operations. On the diplomatic front, Rome worked to counter Hannibal's efforts to build an anti-Roman coalition. They negotiated with Greek states to keep pressure on Macedonia, effectively neutralizing Philip V's ability to intervene directly in Italy. Within Italy itself, they combined harsh punishment of defectors with generous terms for communities that returned to the Roman alliance, creating both stick and carrot to rebuild their network of alliances. As your consciousness drifts between wakefulness and dreams, consider how these multifaceted approaches, military, diplomatic, psychological, reflected Rome's institutional sophistication and strategic flexibility. Rather than clinging to failed methods or surrendering to despair after unprecedented defeats, the Republic analyzed its failures, adapted its approaches, and marshaled its considerable resources for a protracted struggle that played to its strengths rather than its opponents. Meanwhile, Hannibal's position in Italy gradually became more challenging. His diplomatic and political strategy of breaking apart Rome's alliance system achieved only partial success. While he gained significant territory in southern Italy, the core of the Roman alliance, central Italy, and most of the Latin cities remained loyal to Rome. The defections he did secure added territories to defend without necessarily providing proportionate military resources, stretching his already limited forces. Logistically, Hannibal faced increasing difficulties as the war progressed. Operating far from his bases in Spain and North Africa, he could not easily receive reinforcements or supplies. His army relied primarily on what it could gather locally, but as Roman forces adapted their strategy to deny him access to resources, this became more problematic. The territories allied to him expected protection, limiting his mobility as he could not abandon them to Roman counterattacks without risking further defections. Hannibal's remarkable leadership continued to maintain the cohesion and fighting effectiveness of his multinational army, despite these challenges. His core of veteran troops remained loyal and formidable, and he continued to win tactical victories when Roman commanders made the mistake of engaging him directly. However, these successes could not overcome the strategic problems of fighting a lengthy campaign so far from his home bases against an enemy with superior resources and growing strategic sophistication. The war in Italy settled into a pattern of limited engagements rather than decisive battles. Hannibal remained a dangerous force, able to move throughout southern Italy and occasionally strike effectively against Roman armies, unwary enough to face him on disadvantageous terms. However, he could not force a conclusion to the conflict through military action alone, and his strategic position gradually eroded as Rome reconquered territories and cut off his potential sources of supply and reinforcement. A pivotal moment came in 27 BCE when Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, having rebuilt Carthaginian forces in Spain despite Roman opposition, finally attempted to bring reinforcements to Italy. Marching with a substantial army along the same Alpine route Hannibal had used a decade earlier, Hasdrubal successfully reached northern Italy and sent messages to coordinate a junction with his brother's forces. This potential combination of two Carthaginian armies presented a severe threat to Rome's containment strategy. The Roman response demonstrated how far they had come since the dark days after Cannae. The consuls, Marcus Livius Salinator and Gaius Claudius Nero, coordinated their actions with remarkable effectiveness. Nero, who was shadowing Hannibal in southern Italy, took a bold gamble, leaving part of his force to maintain the appearance of his full army's presence. He force-marched his best troops nearly 300 miles north in just 6 days to reinforce Livius, who was facing Hasdrubal. As you drift deeper towards sleep, imagine the determination of these Roman legionaries marching north along Italian roads, covering 40 to 50 miles daily, an extraordinary pace for infantry, driven by the knowledge that the fate of their republic might hinge on their timely arrival. In towns along their route, citizens provide food and supplies already prepared, so no time is lost, some joining the column as it passes, others cheering the soldiers on their way. There is a sense of common purpose, of an entire society mobilized in its own defense. The resulting battle of the Metaurus River was a decisive Roman victory. Hasdrubal was killed, and his army destroyed before Hannibal even learned of his brother's arrival in Italy. In a chilling epilogue, Nero returned to his camp in the south and had Hasdrubal's severed head thrown into the Carthaginian outposts, the first notification Hannibal received that his long-awaited reinforcements had been destroyed. According to ancient sources, Hannibal declared that he recognized in this defeat the doom of Carthage. This victory marked a turning point in the war in Italy. Without hope of substantial reinforcement, Hannibal was forced into an increasingly defensive posture, withdrawing his forces into the mountainous Bruttium region in the toe of the Italian peninsula. He remained undefeated personally, but his strategic position had become untenable. The initiative had passed decisively to Rome. As the Roman position in Italy stabilized, they increasingly turned their attention to taking the war to Carthaginian territory. In Spain, the younger Scipio had achieved remarkable success, capturing New Carthage, Cartagena, in a brilliant combined land and sea operation in 209 BCE, and gradually extending Roman control throughout the peninsula. By 206 BCE, after his victory at Ilipa, Spain was largely lost to Carthage, depriving them of a major source of silver, manpower, and other resources. Building on these successes, Scipio proposed a bold strategy, carrying the war directly to North Africa, just as Hannibal had brought it to Italy. After some resistance from more conservative elements in the Senate, who feared leaving Italy exposed while Hannibal remained undefeated on the peninsula, Scipio was authorized to proceed with the African expedition. In 2004 BCE, he landed near Utica with a substantial Roman force and quickly demonstrated the same tactical brilliance that had served him well in Spain. As the night embraces you completely and historical events continue to unfold in your imagination, consider the remarkable trajectory of Rome's recovery. From the nadir of Cannae, when their military system seemed utterly broken and their alliance network on the verge of collapse, they had gradually regained the strategic initiative through a combination of institutional resilience, willingness to adapt their methods, and remarkable determination. Rather than a single dramatic reversal, it was this steady, methodical recovery, rebuilding their forces, reclaiming lost territories, cutting off Hannibal's sources of supply and reinforcement, that ultimately shifted the war's momentum. The Roman ability to learn from defeat, rather than being defined by it, proved crucial to this recovery. They studied Hannibal's tactics and adapted elements of them for their own use. They recognized the weaknesses in their traditional military system, particularly their cavalry, which had been consistently outperformed by Carthaginian and Numidian horsemen, and took steps to address these deficiencies. They developed a more sophisticated approach to strategic coordination, managing multiple theaters of war, and allocating resources according to a global strategy, rather than responding reactively to immediate threats. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Romans demonstrated a psychological resilience that allowed them to absorb punishing defeats without surrendering their confidence in ultimate victory. This collective determination, institutionalized in the Senate's refusal to consider peace terms, even after Cannae, and maintain 3 years of difficult fighting, enabled them to outlast a tactically superior opponent whose strategic position was ultimately unsustainable. As you sink into the deepest phases of sleep, know that when next we continue this historical journey, we will explore how Rome's strategic patience and adaptation finally bore fruit as the war expanded beyond Italy to the wider Mediterranean world. The center of gravity would shift to Spain, Sicily, and ultimately North Africa itself, where Scipio Africanus would emerge as Rome's answer to Hannibal, a general whose tactical brilliance could match the Carthaginian master on equal terms, bringing the Second Punic War to its dramatic conclusion. As you settle comfortably into the peaceful embrace of night, let us turn our attention beyond the Italian peninsula to explore how the Second Punic War unfolded across the wider Mediterranean world. While Hannibal's campaign in Italy has understandably dominated historical accounts due to its dramatic character and direct threat to Rome itself, equally consequential campaigns were being waged in Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and eventually North Africa theatres that would ultimately prove decisive in determining the war's outcome. Spain emerged as a crucial theatre almost immediately after the war's outbreak. This region had been the power base from which Hannibal launched his invasion of Italy, and it remained vital to Carthaginian interests as a source of silver, manpower, and other resources. After Hannibal's departure with the main army, his brother Hasdrubal Barca remained in command of substantial Carthaginian forces in the Iberian Peninsula, charged with maintaining control of these territories and potentially organizing reinforcements for the Italian campaign. Rome recognized Spain's strategic importance and moved quickly to challenge Carthaginian control there. In 218 BCE, the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, after being outmaneuvered by Hannibal in southern Gaul, sent his legions to Spain under the command of his brother Gnaeus, while he himself returned to Italy to organize defenses against Hannibal's invasion. Publius joined his brother in Spain the following year, and together, the Scipio brothers established a Roman presence north of the Ebro River, gradually expanding southward into territory previously controlled by Carthage. As your body relaxes deeply into rest, envision the diverse landscapes of ancient Spain, rugged mountains, fertile river valleys, coastal plains, and arid plateaus, across which this crucial secondary campaign unfolded. The warfare here differed from the great set-piece battles of the Italian theatre, featuring more raids, sieges, and complex diplomatic maneuvering as both powers sought to win over the numerous indigenous Iberian tribes whose support could tip the balance of power. For 7 years, the Scipio brothers conducted an effective campaign that achieved significant success despite their distance from Roman support and supplies. They prevented Hasdrubal from sending substantial reinforcements to Hannibal in Italy, won over many Iberian tribes to the Roman side, and gradually pushed the front lines southward. Their greatest success came at the Battle of Dertosa, modern Tortosa, in 25 BCE, where they defeated Hasdrubal's attempt to break through to Italy with reinforcements for his brother. These Spanish campaigns demonstrated Roman strategic sophistication, recognizing that containing Hannibal required not just opposing him directly in Italy, but cutting off his potential sources of reinforcement and supply. They also reflected Rome's remarkable ability to project power across long distances and maintain operations far from home territory, capabilities that would later enable their Mediterranean-wide empire. However, the fortunes of war turned against Rome in Spain in 211 BCE. The Scipio brothers, perhaps overconfident after their successes and facing a strengthened Carthaginian position after the arrival of Hasdrubal Gisco with reinforcements from North Africa, divided their forces to cover more territory. This division proved fatal when the Carthaginians concentrated their armies and defeated the Romans in separate engagements. Both Publius and Gnaeus Scipio were killed, and Roman forces were pushed back to their initial positions north of the Ebro. This crisis prompted a decisive Roman response. In 210 BCE, they sent the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the deceased commander and future Scipio Africanus, to take command in Spain. Though only 25 years old and lacking the senior magistracies normally required for such an important command, Scipio had already demonstrated exceptional promise and was granted proconsular authority through a special vote of the popular assembly. Scipio's appointment marked a significant moment in the war, the emergence of a Roman commander whose strategic vision and tactical brilliance could match Hannibal's own. Where earlier Roman generals had primarily focused on containing the Carthaginian threat through caution and attrition, Scipio would demonstrate a more aggressive, innovative approach that turned Hannibal's own methods against Carthage. As your consciousness drifts between wakefulness and dreams, picture the young Scipio arriving in Spain to take command of demoralized Roman forces, still recovering from the defeat and death of his father and uncle. Despite his youth, he projects confidence and authority, quickly reorganizing the army and gathering intelligence about Carthaginian dispositions and vulnerabilities. There is something in his manner, a combination of analytical intelligence, personal courage, and charismatic leadership that inspires renewed confidence among his troops. Scipio's first major action in Spain demonstrated his boldness and originality. Rather than engaging the three separated Carthaginian armies directly, he launched a surprise attack against New Carthage, Cartagena, the main Carthaginian base on the Spanish coast. This city contained significant war supplies, hostages from Iberian tribes, ensuring their loyalty to Carthage, and access to an excellent harbour. In a brilliantly coordinated land and sea operation in 209 BCE, Scipio captured the supposedly impregnable city in a single day, dealing a severe blow to Carthaginian power in Spain and demonstrating his military genius. The capture of New Carthage provided immediate practical benefits, substantial war materials, control of the region's richest silver mines, and the release of Iberian hostages, which helped shift many local tribes to the Roman side. More broadly, it established Scipio's reputation as a commander of exceptional capability and showed that Rome had recovered its military confidence after the disasters of the war's early years. Over the next 2 years, Scipio systematically dismantled Carthaginian power in Spain. At the Battle of Baecula in 2008 BCE, he defeated Hasdrubal Barca, though he deliberately allowed his opponent to escape northward with a portion of his army. Perhaps recognizing that Hasdrubal's departure for Italy would actually simplify his own task in Spain. The climactic engagement came at Ilipa in 26 BCE, where Scipio, significantly outnumbered, used innovative tactics to achieve a decisive victory against the combined Carthaginian forces under Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago Barca, Hannibal's younger brother. The Battle of Ilipa demonstrated Scipio's tactical sophistication. For several days, he established a pattern of deploying his strongest troops in the center, leading the Carthaginians to expect this formation. On the day of battle, however, he reversed his deployment, placing his best troops on the wings and his less reliable allied forces in the center. He also launched his attack unusually early, before the Carthaginians had eaten their morning meal, catching them somewhat unprepared. When battle was joined, his strong wings crushed the Carthaginian flanks, while his center merely held its ground, eventually resulting in a double envelopment reminiscent of Hannibal's tactic at Cannae, but achieved through different methods. The Carthaginian army disintegrated, and with this victory, Rome effectively secured control of most of Spain. As the night deepens around you and these ancient campaigns unfold in your imagination, consider how the Spanish theatre, though secondary in the popular conception of the war, proved strategically crucial. By establishing control over Spain, Rome denied Carthage access to the silver mines that helped finance their war effort, prevented the flow of Iberian recruits to Hannibal's army in Italy, and eliminated the possibility of major reinforcements reaching him overland. The campaigns also revealed Scipio's exceptional abilities, preparing him for the even more decisive role he would later play in the war's final phase. While Spain witnessed this dramatic shift in fortunes, Sicily emerged as another vital theatre of operations. The island's strategic importance derived from several factors: its agricultural productivity, particularly grain production, vital for feeding armies and civilian populations, its position commanding central Mediterranean sea lanes, and its potential as a base for operations against either Italy or North Africa. When the Second Punic War began, most of Sicily was securely under Roman control, a legacy of their victory in the First Punic War. However, the political situation changed dramatically after Cannae, when Hieronymus, the young grandson and successor of King Hero II of Syracuse, abandoned his grandfather's long-standing alliance with Rome in favor of Carthage. Though Hieronymus was soon assassinated, Syracuse remained in the anti-Roman camp under the influence of pro-Carthaginian factions, creating a serious threat to Rome's position on the island. Rome responded by dispatching the consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus, one of their most experienced commanders, to restore control. What followed was a 2-year siege of Syracuse, 214–214 Sals, BCE, made famous by the involvement of the mathematician Archimedes, who designed innovative defensive machinery to resist the Roman assault. These included improved catapults, mechanical claws that could lift attacking ships partially out of the water, and possibly arrangements of mirrors to focus sunlight onto Roman vessels, though modern experiments suggest this. As your body settles more deeply into relaxation, imagine the scene at Syracuse during this prolonged siege. Roman ships approaching the harbour walls under cover of darkness, suddenly illuminated by massive torches mounted on the defences. catapults hurling stones with unprecedented accuracy due to Archimedes' mathematical calculations, strange mechanical devices extending from the walls to grapple with siege engines. The combination of traditional fortifications with these innovative defensive measures made Syracuse an exceptionally difficult target, frustrating Roman efforts for many months. Eventually, Marcellus captured Syracuse through a combination of military pressure and internal betrayal, with some defenders revealing a vulnerable section of the walls during a festival. In the subsequent sack of the city, Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier, despite Marcellus's orders to spare him. A symbolic moment representing the collision of Greek intellectual achievement with Roman military power. With the fall of Syracuse, resistance to Rome in Sicily largely collapsed, though mopping up operations against remaining Carthaginian forces continued until 210 BCE, when the island was securely back under Roman control. The restoration of Roman dominance in Sicily ensured their access to its agricultural productivity, particularly its grain, which helped sustain the war effort. It also secured their control of central Mediterranean sea lanes, facilitating movement of forces and supplies while constraining Carthaginian naval operations. Perhaps most importantly for the war's later phases, it established a potential launching point for operations against Carthage's North African homeland. In Sardinia and Corsica, which Carthage had been forced to cede to Rome after the First Punic War, limited operations occurred early in the conflict when Carthage attempted to capitalize on local discontent and regain control. However, Roman naval superiority and prompt military response prevented any significant change in the status quo. These islands remained securely under Roman control, protecting the sea lanes between Italy and Spain, and denying Carthage bases from which to threaten Italian shipping or coastal communities. The naval dimension of the war, though less dramatic than the land campaigns, played an important strategic role. After initial setbacks, Rome reasserted the naval supremacy it had achieved during the First Punic War. This control of the sea allowed them to move forces and supplies between theatres, maintain communications with armies operating far from Italy, and gradually constrict Carthage's ability to support its forces overseas. Roman naval dominance was never absolute. Carthaginian ships still operated effectively in some areas, particularly around their North African home waters, but it became a significant factor favoring Rome in the war's later stages. As night cradles you in its peaceful embrace, and these strategic patterns take shape in your mind, consider how Rome's approach to the wider war reflected both their institutional strengths and the lessons they had learned from earlier defeats. Their ability to conduct simultaneous campaigns across multiple theatres demonstrated remarkable organizational capability for an ancient state. Their willingness to commit substantial resources to theatres beyond Italy, even while Hannibal remained undefeated on the peninsula, showed strategic vision that transcended immediate threats to focus on the war's ultimate resolution. By 2006 BCE, with Spain largely secured under Scipio's leadership and Sicily firmly back under Roman control, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically in Rome's favor. Though Hannibal remained undefeated in southern Italy, his position had become increasingly constrained. Without substantial reinforcement from Spain or significant new Italian allies, he could not achieve a decisive victory. Meanwhile, Rome had reclaimed most of the Italian communities that had defected after Cannae and had developed a generation of commanders, led by Scipio, who had studied Hannibal's methods and learned to adapt them for Roman use. The stage was now set for the final phase of the war. Scipio, returning from Spain in triumph, proposed a bold strategy. Rather than continuing the attritional approach against Hannibal in Italy, Rome should strike directly at Carthage in North Africa, forcing them to recall their greatest general to defend the homeland. After debate in the Senate, where more conservative elements expressed concern about leaving Italy while Hannibal remained undefeated, Scipio was elected consul for 2005 BCE and authorized to implement his strategy. As your consciousness drifts toward the deepest phases of sleep, envision the growing confidence in Rome as the strategic initiative passed decisively to their side. After years of fighting defensively, absorbing punishing defeats, and gradually rebuilding their strength, they were now poised to take the war directly to their adversary's homeland. The wider Mediterranean campaigns had created the conditions for this decisive shift, demonstrating how theatres often considered secondary can prove strategically crucial in determining a war's ultimate outcome. When next we continue this historical journey, we will explore how Scipio Africanus emerged as Rome's answer to Hannibal. A general whose tactical brilliance, strategic vision, and leadership qualities could match those of Carthage's greatest commander. The final confrontation between these exceptional military minds would bring the Second Punic War to its dramatic conclusion, forever changing the balance of power in the Mediterranean world. As the gentle embrace of night surrounds you, let us turn our attention to the remarkable figure who would emerge as Rome's greatest general in the Second Punic War, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later honored with the agnomen Africanus for his decisive victory over Carthage on African soil. In Scipio, Rome found a commander whose combination of strategic vision, tactical brilliance, and leadership qualities could finally match those of Hannibal himself, bringing to a successful conclusion a war that had threatened the very existence of the Roman state. Born around 236 BCE into a prominent patrician family with a strong military tradition, Scipio's early life was shaped by the onset of the Second Punic War when he was still a young man. His first recorded military action came at the Battle of Ticinus in 218 BCE, where, as a cavalryman of just 17, he reportedly saved his wounded father, the consul commanding Roman forces, from capture or death, an act of filial devotion and personal courage that foreshadowed his later qualities as a leader. Scipio was also present at the disastrous Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where he was one of the few Roman officers to escape the carnage. In the aftermath of that defeat, when some young nobles were contemplating fleeing Italy in despair, Scipio reportedly drew his sword and compelled them to swear an oath never to abandon Rome. Another anecdote that, whether strictly historical or somewhat embellished, captures his emerging role as a figure of determination and inspiration during the Republic's darkest hours. The defining tragedy and opportunity of Scipio's early career came in 211 BCE, when his father and uncle, commanding Roman forces in Spain, were killed in separate engagements against Carthaginian armies. This dual loss was both a personal blow and a serious military setback for Rome, as it temporarily reversed their progress in the crucial Spanish theatre. Yet it also created the circumstances for Scipio's extraordinary rise to prominence at an unusually young age. As you settle more deeply into relaxation, imagine the political scene in Rome in 210 BCE as the Republic faced the challenge of selecting a new commander for the Spanish front. The situation was precarious. Roman forces had been pushed back to defensive positions north of the Ebro River, while Carthaginian armies controlled most of the peninsula. The position required a leader of exceptional ability, yet experienced senior commanders were already committed to containing Hannibal in Italy or managing other theatres of the war. In an unprecedented move, the 25-year-old Scipio put himself forward for the command, despite having held only the junior magistracy of Aedile rather than the senior positions normally required for such responsibility. Although some senators objected to his youth and limited experience, the popular assembly voted unanimously to grant him proconsular authority in Spain, a remarkable expression of confidence that the young commander would subsequently justify beyond all expectations. Scipio's approach to command revealed a combination of qualities that set him apart from previous Roman generals. Like Hannibal, he demonstrated exceptional tactical creativity, devising innovative battle plans adapted to specific circumstances rather than following formulaic approaches. He showed remarkable strategic vision, identifying and striking at enemy centers of gravity rather than being distracted by secondary objectives. His leadership style balanced discipline with humanity, inspiring deep personal loyalty while maintaining necessary military order. You can feel the shift in the air. For years, the war had raged across the Italian countryside, its hills and forests echoing with the clash of steel and the cries of men. But now, the rhythm of the Punic War was changing. The tide was pulling southward, across the sea, to the very soil from which it had begun. The year is 204 BCE, and Rome, weary of Hannibal's elusive tactics in Italy, has chosen a bold new path to strike Carthage itself. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young Roman general who had earned his reputation in Spain, now sails for Africa. His arrival is not merely military, it is symbolic. Where Hannibal had brought terror to the Roman heartland, Scipio now brings fear to the gates of Carthage. Roman ships anchor in African harbors, their sails snapping in the wind, their prows casting long shadows across the reddish sand. Elephants bellow in distant pens. Slaves whisper of what is to come. The landscape is foreign to the Roman soldiers. Wide open plains under burning skies, groves of olive trees twisted by centuries of wind, and the faint shimmer of salt marshes. But the people of Carthage feel something deeper, the trembling of the earth beneath their feet as the Roman war machine draws closer. For the first time in decades, the war is at their doorstep. The decision to invade Africa is more than strategic. It is psychological. By forcing Carthage to defend its homeland, Rome has cornered its old rival. The city's leaders, terrified of ruin, recall their greatest weapon, Hannibal Barca. After 16 years of campaigning in Italy, years of stunning victories and bitter stalemates, he is called home. His departure is heavy with sorrow. He leaves behind the land he has bled across, the Italian fields that had become his grim companions. He boards his ship in silence, watching the shoreline drift away, knowing that the war he once dominated now turns toward a final reckoning. In Carthage, he will once again take up arms, but this time on the defensive. In the capital, tension hums in the marble halls. Families prepare to flee. Council members debate furiously in shaded courtyards. Carthage is not the city it was when Hannibal first crossed the Alps. It is bruised, weary, uncertain, but it still possesses pride. And Hannibal's return rekindles a flicker of hope. From a modern lens, the shift from Italy to Africa reveals a timeless strategy. When direct confrontation fails, strike at the heart of your opponent's identity, their sense of safety. Rome's decision wasn't just about geography. It was about forcing a psychological collapse. And so, the stage is set. The veteran general returns to defend the homeland he left so long ago, while across the African plains, Scipio prepares to end the war in a single stroke. Two destinies, long intertwined, now bend toward a single horizon, toward Zama. The sun rises over the African plain, its rays slow and golden, casting long, trembling shadows across the parched earth. This is Zama. Not a city, but a place, a field where the wind carries the breath of two empires. The dust is already rising, not from combat, but from preparation. Thousands of men, animals, carts, and weapons shift into position. Today will decide the fate of a generation. You are there. You can feel it, the heavy quiet before the roar. Two great commanders, veterans of decades of war, now face one another for the first time. Scipio, calm and composed, his armor polished, his soldiers trained to precision. Hannibal, older now, lean and gaunt, his eyes shadowed with the weight of memory. They had both come of age through blood and strategy, and now destiny demands their meeting. Before the battle begins, the two men ride out to speak alone. Their words are lost to history, but we can imagine the tone, respectful, sorrowful, perhaps even tired. Hannibal proposes peace. Scipio declines, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. The time for negotiation has passed. Rome demands resolution. As the Roman formations align in maniples, those flexible, disciplined blocks that had come to define their military superiority. Hannibal arranges his elephants at the front, followed by mercenaries, then his Carthaginian citizen soldiers, and finally, in reserve, the veterans from his long Italian campaign. These men are hardened, dangerous, but they are few. The elephants charge first, but Scipio has trained his men well. They open corridors in the ranks, allowing the beasts to pass through with minimal chaos, then counterattack with javelins and slings. The Roman cavalry flanks swiftly, pressing at Hannibal's sides. Dust chokes the sky. Horns blare. Steel sings. For hours, the battle balances. Mercenaries fight hard, but break. The citizen soldiers hold longer. And then Hannibal's veterans enter. They push the Romans back. For a moment, it seems the old general might snatch one last miracle. But Scipio adapts again. He pulls back his front lines to lure Hannibal's troops forward. And when they advance, the Roman cavalry, having circled back from the rear, strikes them from behind. Hannibal realizes it instantly. He is surrounded. The slaughter is controlled, but decisive. Carthaginian bodies pile upon the African dirt. Cries of pain mix with silence. The earth drinks deeply. Zama is not just a battle. It is the end of an era. The Roman Republic, battered and hardened by war, has triumphed. Carthage, proud and ancient, has fallen. Hannibal survives, barely, but he knows what has been lost. So does Scipio, who treats the defeated with surprising dignity. The dust settles, the noise fades, the African sun continues its climb, indifferent to the blood spilled below. But history does not forget. Zama becomes legend, not because it was brutal, but because it was final. And yet, even as Rome celebrates, the story is not over. The aftermath of war brings a new kind of reckoning, one of terms, of punishment, and of uneasy peace. The battlefield at Zama has quieted, but the consequences echo far beyond the bodies left in the dust. The war is over. Rome has won, but the price of that victory now begins to take shape, not in steel or blood, but in ink and surrender. In Carthage, silence falls across the once defiant city. The temples remain standing, but their gods have not answered. Mothers hold their children closer. Merchants shutter their shops. Soldiers lay down their weapons. The city waits, breath held, for the terms of peace. Scipio enters not as a conqueror filled with triumph, but as a man burdened by the weight of resolution. His army is disciplined, his eyes solemn. He knows what must come next, and though he may pity Carthage, he serves Rome. The terms are severe. Carthage must surrender all warships. Every vessel that once patrolled the sea with pride, now dragged to the harbour and set ablaze. The sky turns black as sails, rope and wood vanish in flame. Onlookers weep openly. The harbour that had once symbolised Carthaginian mastery now becomes a graveyard of maritime dreams. Next come the elephants. No more are they to be bred or trained for war. Carthage is stripped of its ability to defend itself. Its foreign territories are ceded. It must pay an enormous indemnity, spread across 50 years. Rome will station observers to ensure compliance. Carthage is left standing, but barely. And yet, Scipio spares the city itself. But Scipio, perhaps moved by Hannibal's final gesture, perhaps guided by a deeper sense of justice, chooses restraint. The war is finished, but the seed of resentment remains buried beneath the surface. In Rome, the atmosphere is triumphant but tense. Senators applaud Scipio's victory. Statues are erected, coins minted in his honor. But already, some fear that peace may not hold. Rome has become something new. No longer a city fighting for survival, but an empire poised to expand. In Carthage, the atmosphere is hollow. The streets are quiet. The people obey, but they do not forget. The children who grow up under this peace will remember the fires. The older generation carries the humiliation in silence. Modern ears might hear echoes here. The challenge of peace after prolonged war. How the defeated are treated not only determines the present, but sows the future. Too lenient and resentment festers. Too harsh and you create a martyrdom that breeds revenge. Carthage, bound by treaty and stripped of defense, is now a shell of its former self, but not erased. And Hannibal, he does not die at Zama. He walks away from the battlefield, a survivor, but not a victor. Soon, Rome will demand more than Carthage's weapons. They will demand the man who led it for so long. As treaties are signed and legions march home, one truth becomes clear. Though the war is officially over, its shadow stretches far into the future. And for Hannibal, exile begins. Not only from his homeland, but from the history he helped shape. The winds that once filled the sails of Roman warships now drift softly across empty shores. Where once legions marched and cities burned, there is now silence. Just the sound of waves washing over stone, that once echoed with the voices of merchants, of generals, of children who never knew what history they stood inside. The Punic Wars have ended. Their noise has faded, their fire long cooled, but their imprint remains, etched not only in the ruins that cling to Mediterranean coastlines, but in the memory of what it means to rise, to fall, to endure. Carthage is no more. Rome, triumphant, would itself one day fracture and fade. And yet, through all of it, the human story continues. We walk today among remnants. A broken column, its fluted edge kissed by sunlight. A warm mosaic hidden beneath dust, still glowing with color. In these fragments, we glimpse not just war and conquest, but ambition, grief, courage, and fear. The very same emotions we carry now. Civilizations rise like waves. They crest, brilliant and high, and then collapse back into the sea of time. But beneath that rhythm lies something steady, our shared capacity for hope, for creation, for learning. Even in defeat, Carthage taught us resilience. Even in victory, Rome revealed the dangers of power unchecked. To reflect on the Punic Wars is not to celebrate destruction. It is to understand how history speaks in echoes, how every triumph contains the seeds of future peril, and how, when dust settles, what remains is not the sword, but the story. Under modern skies, travelers still walk the ruins of Carthage. They run fingers across scorched stone, gaze out over the blue sweep of the Mediterranean, and wonder what voices once filled the air. Was it laughter? Was it prayer? Was it fear? That same sea has carried goods and gods, dreams and dread across centuries. It has witnessed the ambitions of empires, the quiet endurance of fishermen, and the whispered prayers of refugees. And through it all, it remains, like time itself, vast, patient, and unknowable. So what do the Punic Wars offer us now? They remind us that no conflict is eternal, but every choice echoes. That greatness is not in domination, but in what is built and rebuilt when war ends. They remind us that memory matters, that telling stories and listening to them is how we carry the past into the present with care and meaning. And as your eyes begin to close, let this be your final thought tonight. You are part of that story. You who have walked the ruined streets of Carthage in your mind, who have sailed with Scipio and stood with Hannibal in the dust. You are the next voice in the great chorus of history. The world turns, empires rise and fall, but the soul of humanity endures. Sleep now, knowing that tomorrow brings another chance to learn, to listen, and to wonder. Good night.